When 3 bullets tore through the frozen night and a woman's scream shattered 12 years of silence, Gideon Thorne knew his war with the world had finally found him. The mountain had been his fortress, loneliness his armor, until 2 desperate souls appeared at his door with blood on their clothes and death on their heels. What he didn't know was that saving them would cost him everything he'd built in solitude and give him everything he'd lost to grief. This is a story of outlaws, blizzards, and the kind of love that's forged in gunfire and ice. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens in these mountains will leave you breathless. The wind came down from the high peaks like the breath of something ancient and furious, carrying snow that cut like broken glass. Gideon Thorne stood in the doorway of his cabin, rifle cradled in the crook of his arm, watching the storm devour the world. The mountains had taught him to read weather the way other men read newspapers, and what he read now was violence. This wasn't the kind of snow that fell soft and quiet in Christmas stories. This was the kind that buried entire wagon trains, that turned men into frozen statues still clutching their reins, that made the Rockies a graveyard for the unprepared. He should have gone inside hours ago. The fire was low, the woodpile needed restocking, and the last of the venison needed smoking before it spoiled. But something held him there in the threshold, some animal instinct that prickled at the back of his neck like spiders' feet. In 12 winters alone on this mountain, he'd learned to trust those instincts. They'd kept him alive when reason would have killed him. The cabin sat in a natural hollow, surrounded by pine and aspen, invisible from the trails below unless you knew exactly where to look. Gideon had chosen this place for that invisibility. After Sarah died, after the fever took her and the baby both, after he'd buried them in ground so frozen he'd nearly broken his back digging, he'd wanted nothing more than to disappear. The mountain had obliged. For 12 years it had hidden him, fed him, and asked nothing in return except respect and vigilance. He was about to turn back inside when he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, the way it sometimes did when it screamed through the canyon. But then it came again, clear this time despite the storm's fury, a sound that didn't belong to the wilderness, a human sound, desperate and raw. Knocking. Someone was knocking on his door. Gideon's grip tightened on the rifle. In 12 years, exactly 3 people had found this cabin. 2 had been trappers he'd known in his previous life, men who'd respected his desire for solitude and left him alone after brief, awkward visits. The 3rd had been a Shoshone hunter who'd shared a meal and a fire without speaking a single word, understanding in the way only other solitary souls could that some silences were sacred. Nobody came to this mountain by accident, not in winter, not in a storm like this. The knocking came again, weaker now, and with it a voice. "Please." A woman's voice, barely audible over the wind. "Please, if anyone's there." Every instinct Gideon had cultivated screamed at him to stay silent, to let the storm swallow whoever had been foolish enough to climb this high in such weather. The mountain had its own justice, harsh but fair. Those who respected it lived, those who didn't died. That was the arrangement, and it had nothing to do with him. But even as he thought it, his hand was already reaching for the bolt, his body betraying 12 years of carefully maintained isolation with a single motion. Because underneath all the frost and fury he'd wrapped around his heart, underneath the carefully constructed walls of solitude, there remained a sliver of the man he'd been before. The man who'd been a husband, who'd wanted to be a father, who'd believed in helping people even when it cost him something. He yanked the door open, and the storm rushed in like an invading army. 2 women stood on his threshold, or rather one stood and one sagged in the other's arms. They were so covered in snow they looked like sculptures carved from ice, their clothes frozen stiff, their faces blue-white in the lamplight that spilled from the cabin. The one still standing, younger, maybe 25, had eyes that burned with a fierce desperation that reminded Gideon of wounded animals he'd seen, creatures that would bite the hand trying to save them simply because pain had made them wild. "Help us," she said, and her voice cracked like breaking ice. "Please. She's dying." The woman in her arms was older, perhaps in her 50s, and unconscious or close to it. Blood had frozen in her hair, dark against the white of the snow, and her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that Gideon recognized from his years of hard living. That was the sound of someone losing the fight. For a long moment that felt like an hour, Gideon stood frozen in his own doorway, caught between 12 years of isolation and a single second of choice. He could turn them away. Should turn them away. Whatever trouble had driven two women up a mountain in a killing storm wasn't his concern. He'd left the world behind, and the world had been content to leave him be. Opening his door to these strangers would crack the foundation of everything he'd built. The older woman's head lolled, and a small sound escaped her lips. Not quite a moan, but close. The younger one's grip tightened, her fingers digging into the unconscious woman's coat with a desperation that spoke of love, of loyalty, of the kind of bonds that made people do foolish, fatal things. Gideon saw his wife's face, fever-bright and failing, saw the way she'd looked at him in those final hours with eyes that begged him to do the impossible, to hold back death with nothing but will and love. He'd failed then. The memory of that failure was carved into his bones deeper than any scar. He stepped aside. "Get in, quickly." The young woman didn't hesitate, didn't waste breath on gratitude. She half dragged, half carried her companion through the door, and Gideon slammed it shut behind them, throwing the bolt with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady. The silence that followed the storm's muffling felt enormous, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the harsh breathing of two people who'd pushed themselves far past human limits. In the lamplight, with the snow beginning to melt off them in rivulets, Gideon could see them more clearly. The young one was rail-thin under her frozen coat, her face all sharp angles and harder eyes, dark hair plastered to her skull. She had the look of someone who'd learned early that the world was made of teeth and thorns, someone who'd stopped expecting kindness and learned to survive on grit alone. But her hands, as they cradled the older woman, were gentle in a way that suggested she hadn't entirely forgotten how to care. The older one was in bad shape. Besides the head wound, which looked like it had come from a bad fall or a blow, she was suffering from advanced hypothermia. Her lips were blue, her skin had the waxy quality of someone well on their way to freezing to death, and she'd stopped shivering, which Gideon knew was a bad sign. When the body stopped trying to warm itself, it meant it was giving up the fight. "What happened?" Gideon heard himself ask, his voice rough from disuse. He hardly spoke anymore except to curse at stubborn logs or mutter instructions to himself while working. "We got lost in the storm," the young woman said, the lie so obvious it was almost insulting. "Please, she needs—" "Don't!" Gideon cut her off, his voice hard. "Don't insult me with lies under my own roof. You didn't get lost. Nobody comes up this mountain by accident, and nobody climbs this high in weather like this unless they're running from something worse than cold. So, before I do another damn thing to help you, you're going to tell me what kind of trouble you've brought to my door." The young woman's eyes flashed, that wounded animal look intensifying. For a second, Gideon thought she might actually attack him, despite the fact that he was twice her size and armed. But then the fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by something that looked almost like relief, as if being called on her lies was somehow better than having them believed. "We're running," she said simply. "From the town. From the law, from people who want us dead or worse." "For what? Does it matter?" She met his eyes, and he saw something in hers that made him think of his own reflection in the mountain streams, a kind of weary resignation mixed with defiance. "Whatever I tell you, you'll either believe it or you won't. You'll either help us or throw us back out into that storm. So I'll make it simple. We didn't do what they said we did. But in this world, truth matters less than who's got the power to make their version stick. And we don't." Gideon studied her for a long moment, weighing what he saw against 12 years of carefully honed instincts. He'd known plenty of liars in his previous life, men who could look you in the eye and swear the sun rose in the west if it served their purpose. This woman wasn't one of them. Whatever the truth of her situation, she believed she was innocent. Whether she actually was remained to be seen. But the older woman was dying. That much wasn't up for debate. "All right," he said finally. "Truth or lies, we sort that out later. Right now, she freezes or she doesn't, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let someone die on my floor while we argue philosophy." The relief that washed over the young woman's face was so profound it made her look years younger, almost childlike for a moment. Thank you," Thank you, I... Save it. Gideon was already moving, his body falling into the rhythms of crisis management that he'd learned during the war and refined through years of solitary survival. Get her coat off, all her wet clothes. There's blankets in that chest. The wool ones, not the cotton. I need to build up this fire and heat water. Can you follow instructions without arguing? Yes. Then move. The next hour passed in a blur of frantic activity. Gideon built the fire up to a roaring inferno, threw on log after log until the cabin's single room was almost uncomfortably hot. He heated water, checked the older woman's pupils, monitored her breathing. The young one, she still hadn't offered a name, worked with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with injuries before, stripping the unconscious woman down to her skin with no trace of embarrassment, wrapping her in layers of wool blankets, checking her extremities for frostbite. "What's her name?" Gideon asked as he cleaned the head wound, which looked worse than it was. Scalp wounds always bled like murder, but this one wasn't deep. "Evelyn?" "Evelyn Rowe." The young woman hesitated, then added, "I'm Clara Voss." "Gideon Thorne, how'd she get this?" "Fell on the ice about 3 miles down, hit her head on a rock. She was already weak from before." Before what? Clara's jaw tightened. Before the beatings. Before they dragged her through town behind a horse. Before they decided she was a witch who'd cursed the Miller baby and needed to be taught a lesson. Gideon's hand stilled for just a second before continuing their work. He'd left civilization behind to escape its cruelties, but apparently cruelty had longer legs than he'd given it credit for. A witch. "You don't have to believe me." "I don't believe in witches," Gideon said flatly. "But I've seen what happens when people do. Seen what mobs will do to anyone who's different, anyone who scares them or makes them feel small. Saw it during the war. Saw it after." He finished bandaging Evelyn's head and sat back on his heels. "She's stable. Hypothermia is the main concern now. Keep her warm, keep her dry, monitor her breathing. If it gets shallower or she starts turning blue again, wake me." "Wake you? Where are you going?" "Nowhere. But I haven't slept in close to 30 hours, and if I'm going to deal with whatever comes next, I need to be sharp." He stood, his joints popping from the sudden movement. "You should sleep too." "I can't. I need to watch her." Gideon studied the stubborn set of Clara's jaw and recognized it for what it was. The same kind of fierce protectiveness he'd felt for Sarah. The kind that made you believe you could hold back death through sheer will if you just refused to close your eyes. He'd learned the hard way that will wasn't enough. "You're no good to her dead on your feet," he said, not unkindly. "I'll wake you in 4 hours. You can watch her then." For a moment he thought she'd argue, but exhaustion won out over stubbornness. She nodded once, a sharp jerk of her chin, and curled up on the floor next to Evelyn with one hand resting on the older woman's shoulder, like a child afraid of losing her mother in a crowd. Gideon banked the fire, checked the door bolt one more time, and settled into his chair with the rifle across his lap. Old habits from the war. Never sleep when strangers are present. Never trust anyone you haven't known for years. Never let your guard down even when kindness seems warranted. These women might be victims fleeing injustice, or they might be something else entirely. Time would tell. Outside, the storm howled and raged, throwing itself against the mountain with the fury of something alive. Inside, 3 people who had no business being under the same roof breathed and waited for dawn. Gideon didn't sleep. He watched Clara and Evelyn in the firelight, watched the rise and fall of their breathing, watched the way Clara's hand never left Evelyn's shoulder, even in sleep. And he thought about the choices that had brought him here, to this mountain, to this cabin, to this moment where his careful isolation had been shattered by 2 frozen strangers and a storm that wouldn't quit. He'd come here to escape, to build walls so high and thick that nothing could reach him, nothing could hurt him the way Sarah's death had hurt him. For 12 years those walls had held. Now, watching these 2 women sleep, he felt the first cracks forming. And what terrified him most was how much he wanted to let them spread. When Gideon finally dozed off just before dawn, it was Clara who woke him, not urgently, but with a gentle hand on his shoulder that made him come up swinging before he remembered where he was. She jumped back with a startled gasp, and he caught himself mid-swing, his fist stopping inches from her face. "Sorry," he muttered, lowering his hand. "Reflex." Some reflex, Clara said, but there was a hint of dark humor in her voice. Evelyn's awake, weak but conscious. Gideon crossed to where the older woman lay, still wrapped in blankets but with more color in her face than she'd had last night. Her eyes, when they focused on him, were a sharp blue that suggested a mind still intact despite the battering her body had taken. "You're the hermit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying a note of wry amusement. "The ghost of Black Rock Mountain. I'd heard stories but never quite believed them." "Stories are usually wrong," Gideon replied. "Are they?" Evelyn's gaze was disconcertingly steady. "They say you came here after your wife died, that you buried her and your unborn child and swore you'd never go back to the world that took them from you. They say you'd rather shoot a man than speak to him, that you've become more animal than human up here in the wild." Gideon felt his jaw tighten. "And yet here you are, alive in my cabin, which suggests at least some of those stories are wrong." "Only some." A ghost of a smile touched Evelyn's cracked lips. "Well, I suppose we're lucky you're not the shooting kind, though the day's young yet." "Evelyn," Clara said, a warning note in her voice. "Don't." "Don't what? Don't thank the man who saved our lives? Don't acknowledge that we've imposed on his solitude and put him in danger by coming here?" Evelyn's eyes never left Gideon's face. "I may be half frozen and beaten, girl, but I'm not dead yet, and I'll speak my mind in whatever house I find myself in." Despite himself, Gideon felt a flicker of something that might have been respect. "You need food and rest. After that, we talk about what happens next." "What happens next is we leave as soon as the storm breaks," Evelyn said. "We've brought you enough trouble already." "The storm won't break for days," Gideon said flatly, "and you're not fit to walk to the outhouse, let alone down a mountain in winter. So you'll stay until you can travel without dying in the attempt, and we'll deal with whatever trouble comes." "Why?" Claire's voice was sharp, suspicious. "Why help us at all? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. For all you know, we're exactly what they say we are. Thieves, murderers, worse." "Are you?" "No." "Then that's all I need to know for now." It wasn't, of course. Gideon needed to know a lot more. Who was chasing them? How far behind they were? What these women had supposedly done to warrant being hunted through a killing storm? But those questions could wait until everyone had eaten and rested and the immediate crisis had passed. He cooked breakfast, venison steaks, fried potatoes, the last of his coffee, and watched as Clara and Evelyn ate with the desperate hunger of people who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the world, but inside the cabin, something like peace settled over them. It was temporary, fragile, and probably dangerous. But for the first time in 12 years, Gideon's cabin held something other than grief and silence. He told himself it meant nothing, that once the storm passed and these women were strong enough to travel, they'd leave and he'd go back to his solitary existence. The mountain would swallow all evidence of their presence, and his isolation would be restored. He told himself this and tried to ignore how hollow it sounded even in his own head. The storm lasted 3 days. In that time, the cabin transformed in ways Gideon couldn't have predicted. Clara, once she'd eaten and slept properly, proved to be relentlessly competent in a way that suggested a hard life had taught her to make herself useful or suffer the consequences. She cooked without being asked, cleaned with an efficiency that bordered on aggressive, mended his shirts and socks with neat, precise stitches that put his own crude repairs to shame. Evelyn, still recovering but growing stronger by the day, was different. Where Clara was all sharp edges and constant motion, Evelyn possessed a stillness that reminded Gideon of deep water, calm on the surface but with currents running far below. She watched everything with those sharp blue eyes, missing nothing, saying little but absorbing it all. When she did speak, her words carried weight. It was Evelyn who finally told him their story. On the second night when Clara had fallen into an exhausted sleep and the wind outside had briefly quieted. "We're from Sterling Falls," she began, her voice still weak but steady. "A mining town about 30 miles northeast. I was the school teacher there for 26 years. Clara worked at the general store." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "It was a good life, or as good as life gets for women without husbands in a hard country. We had each other. We had respect, or thought we did. Then the Miller baby died. Gideon said nothing, just waited. Crib death, Evelyn continued. Terrible, tragic, but not uncommon. The child was sickly from birth, everyone knew it. But Mrs. Miller couldn't accept it. Needed someone to blame, and I'd argued with her husband a month prior about his treatment of the Shoshone children in my school. He'd wanted them expelled. I'd refused. So when the baby died, she remembered that argument and decided I'd cursed her child out of spite. And the town believed her? Towns believe what they want to believe, what's convenient to believe. Evelyn's voice held no bitterness, just a weary acceptance of human nature. I was educated, unmarried, too outspoken for a woman. Clara here defended me, which made her suspect as well. Within a week, we'd gone from respected members of the community to witches who needed to be driven out or destroyed. They beat you. Among other things, the law turned a blind eye. The sheriff suggested we leave for our own safety, which was just a polite way of saying they wouldn't stop the mob if we stayed. So we ran. She smiled, a thin, bitter curve of her lips. Not very successfully, as it turns out. They followed you. A few men, the zealous ones, the ones who see themselves as righteous crusaders. They caught up to us about 5 miles from here, but we managed to slip away in the storm. That's when I fell, hit my head. After that, she shrugged. After that, Clara dragged me up a mountain in a blizzard and found the one man in 100 miles who didn't immediately shoot us for trespassing. I'd call that a minor miracle, though I've never been much for believing in those. Gideon absorbed this in silence, his mind working through the implications. 5 miles. That meant their pursuers were likely still close, probably holed up somewhere waiting for the storm to pass. When it did, they'd come looking. How many? He asked. 4 that I saw, maybe more. Armed? Rifles, revolvers. One of them, Thomas Kerr, used to be a bounty hunter. He's not the kind to give up easy. Gideon nodded slowly. 4 armed men, at least one with tracking experience, hunting 2 women they believed were witches. The math wasn't complicated. When the storm broke, those men would come up the mountain. They'd find tracks, eventually. Would find this cabin. And then Gideon would have to make a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long or short that turned out to be. You should have told me this before, he said, though without heat. Would it have changed anything? Would you have thrown us out if you'd known? Gideon thought about it, really thought about it. Would he have? 3 days ago, he might have. 3 days ago, these women were strangers, abstractions, not his problem. But now Clara's presence had filled the cabin with life. The smell of proper cooking, the sound of someone humming while they worked, the sight of mended clothes and swept floors. And Evelyn's quiet strength reminded him of qualities he'd once valued in himself, before grief had turned him hard and cold. No, he said finally. I wouldn't have. Then it didn't need to be said before. Evelyn's eyes held his, and for the first time he saw approval there. You're a good man, Gideon Thorne, whatever stories they tell about you. Your wife was lucky to have you. She's dead, Gideon said flatly. Luck didn't enter into it. She's dead, but you remember her. You honor her memory by how you live. That's a kind of luck she still has, even in death. To be remembered by someone who actually loved her, not just claimed to. Gideon had no answer for that. The conversation had wandered into territory he'd spent 12 years avoiding, places too raw and painful to examine. He stood abruptly, checked the fire, checked the door, checked the windows. Anything to avoid Evelyn's too perceptive gaze. Storm's easing, he said, though it wasn't. We should get some rest. If Evelyn noticed the deflection, she didn't comment on it. She simply nodded, settled back into her blankets, and closed her eyes. But Gideon felt her awareness even in her silence, felt the weight of her understanding like a physical thing. He returned to his chair, rifle across his lap, and watched the 2 women sleep. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, and Gideon Thorne confronted a truth he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd opened his door 3 nights ago. His isolation was already broken. These women had cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was sealed forever, and there was no going back. The only question now was what he'd do about it, whether he'd try to repair the walls or let them crumble entirely. The storm gave him 3 days to decide. On the 4th day, When the sun finally broke through the clouds and turned the snow-covered world into a field of blinding white diamonds, he still didn't have an answer. But the men coming up the mountain wouldn't wait for him to figure it out. The morning the storm finally broke, Gideon woke to find Clara already up, standing at the window with her arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the transformed world. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the pre-dawn light turned everything silver and blue, the snow so pristine it looked like the mountain had been remade overnight into something from a dream. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said without turning around. Gideon grunted, pulling himself out of the chair where he'd spent another mostly sleepless night. His back protested the movement, reminding him that he wasn't as young as he used to be, that 12 years of hard mountain living had carved grooves into his body that wouldn't smooth out. "Beautiful things can kill you up here. That snow's probably 6 feet deep in places. Avalanche weather. You really can't just enjoy anything, can you?" Clara turned to look at him, and in the pale light her face looked younger, softer somehow. "Can't just look at something pretty without cataloging all the ways it might kill you?" "Staying alive requires cataloging," Gideon said, moving to the stove to start coffee. "You want pretty? Go back down to the valley. Mountains don't care about pretty." "No, I suppose they don't." Claire's voice had gone quiet, almost wistful. "But it's still beautiful. Even if it wants to kill me, I can still see that." Something in her tone made Gideon pause, coffee pot in hand. He studied her profile against the window, the way the faint light caught the line of her jaw, the stubborn set of her shoulders. She was too thin. Her clothes hung on her like they'd been made for someone else, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of too many nights without real sleep. But there was also something unbroken in her, some core of strength that all the beatings and running and terror hadn't managed to crack. "How old are you?" he found himself asking. 26. "Why?" "You carry yourself older." "I've had an old kind of life." She turned from the window, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Is Evelyn awake?" "Not yet. Let her sleep. She needs it." Clara nodded, then surprised him by crossing to the stove and taking the coffee pot from his hands. "Let me. You've done enough." For a moment, Gideon considered arguing. This was his cabin, his routine, his carefully maintained territory. But the truth was, having someone else make coffee for the first time in 12 years felt strange in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. So he stepped back and let her work, watching as she moved around his kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who'd learned to make themselves useful in other people's spaces. "You're good at this," he observed. "At what? Making coffee?" "At fitting in, at making yourself needed." Clara's hand stilled for just a second before continuing their work. "It's a survival skill. When you're a woman without family or money, you learn early that being useful is the only currency you have. You make yourself indispensable or you starve." She poured water into the pot, measured out coffee with practiced efficiency. "The general store in Sterling Falls, I worked there for 8 years, started when I was 18. The owner, Mr. Halstead, he was a fair man, but he didn't hire me out of charity. He hired me because I could work harder than his lazy nephew and didn't steal from the till." "What happened to your family?" "Dead. Mother died when I was 12, fever. Father drank himself to death 2 years later. Couldn't live with the grief. Or didn't want to, maybe." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was reciting items from a shopping list. "I had an older brother, but he went west after the war and I never heard from him again. So it was just me. Just me figuring out how to survive in a world that doesn't have much use for women alone." Gideon heard echoes of his own story in hers. Loss, isolation, the slow hardening that came from learning that the world was fundamentally cruel and caring was just another word for vulnerable. But where his response had been to retreat, to build walls and hide behind them, Clara had done the opposite. She'd learned to adapt, to survive by becoming whatever people needed her to be. "How'd you meet Evelyn?" he asked. For the first time, something like warmth crept into Clara's expression. "She came into the store one day, maybe 3 years back. I was having trouble with a customer, a miner who was drunk and getting aggressive, putting his hands where they didn't belong. Evelyn walked right up to him, all 5 feet nothing of her, and told him that if he didn't remove his hands from my person, she'd ensure his children learned about his behavior in their next lesson." Clara smiled at the memory. She was the school teacher. Everyone in town respected her, feared her a little too. The miner left, After that, Evelyn started coming by the store regular. We'd talk. She'd bring me books to read, teach me things. She became family. Gideon finished when Clara trailed off. Yes. Family. Clara poured the coffee, handed him a cup. The only real family I've had since my mother died, which is why I'll kill anyone who tries to take her from me. She said it calmly, without heat or drama, but Gideon believed her absolutely. He'd seen that look before during the war, the look of someone who'd drawn a line in their soul and would die before letting it be crossed. It was the look of soldiers who'd charge into cannon fire to save a wounded friend, the look of mothers defending their children against impossible odds. "They'll come today," he said, just as calmly. "You're hunters. The storm's broken, the trails will be visible again. If they're as determined as Evelyn says, they'll start searching as soon as there's enough light." Claire's fingers tightened around her cup. "I know. So we need to decide what happens when they get here. We leave before they arrive. That's what happens. Evelyn can't travel yet, not far, not fast. You'd make maybe 5 miles before you had to stop, and that's if she didn't collapse halfway. Then I'll carry her." "Through 6 feet of snow? Uphill?" Gideon shook his head. "You're strong, Clara, but you're not that strong. Nobody is." "So what then?" Her voice had gone sharp, defensive. "We just wait here for them to find us? Let them drag Evelyn back to Sterling Falls so they can finish what they started?" "No." Gideon set his coffee down, met her eyes. "We make them think you've moved on. We create a false trail leading away from here, make it look like you kept moving during the storm. They'll follow it, waste time, and by the time they realize they've been tricked, you'll be strong enough to actually travel." Clara stared at him. "You'd do that? Lie to them?" "You'd be choosing a side." "I chose a side the moment I let you in my door. Everything after that is just details. They could come back. Once they realize you helped us, they could come back and let them." Something hard and cold settled into Gideon's voice, the part of him that remembered the war, that remembered what it felt like to make kill or be killed decisions without flinching. "I've got the high ground. I know this mountain better than anyone alive, and I'm not particularly interested in dying today. They're welcome to try." For a long moment, Clara just looked at him, and Gideon saw something shift in her expression. Suspicion giving way to something that might have been hope or trust, or maybe just the desperate gratitude of someone who'd been expecting betrayal and found protection instead. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why risk yourself for us?" It was the same question she'd asked before, but this time Gideon had a different answer. Or rather, he had the honesty to speak the real answer instead of hiding behind deflection. "Because I'm tired," he said. "Tired of being alone, tired of pretending that isolation is the same as safety, that walls can actually protect you from the things that hurt. I came up here to escape, but all I've done is trap myself in a different kind of prison." He picked up his coffee again, took a sip, let the bitter warmth ground him. "Maybe helping you is selfish. Maybe I'm just desperate for something to care about that isn't my own survival. But whatever the reason, I'm in this now. So let's focus on keeping all of us alive." Clara's eyes had gone bright, and for a second Gideon thought she might actually cry. But she blinked it back, swallowed hard, and nodded. Okay. What do you need me to do?" "Wake Evelyn. Feed her. Make sure she's stable. I'm going to take a walk, scout the area, see if I can figure out where they might be camped. When I get back, we'll lay the false trail." He was already pulling on his heavy coat, checking his rifle, when Evelyn's voice stopped him. "You're a terrible liar, Gideon Thorne." He turned to find the older woman awake, propped up on her elbows, watching him with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see straight through all his carefully constructed defenses. "Excuse me?" "That speech you just gave Clara, about being tired of isolation, about wanting something to care about." Evelyn's smile was knowing, almost gentle. "It was pretty, well delivered, but it wasn't the whole truth." "And what's the whole truth, since you know me so well after 3 days?" "The whole truth is that you see us, and you see your wife. You see Clara's age, and remember what it was like to be young and fierce and determined to survive. You see me, and you see someone who needs protection, who needs care, and it awakens something in you that's been dormant for 12 years. Evelyn sat up fully, ignoring Clara's concerned protest. "You're not helping us because you're tired of being alone. You're helping us because we remind you what it felt like to be human, and you've missed it more than you can stand." Gideon felt something twist in his chest, a combination of anger and recognition that made him want to walk out the door and not look back. But Evelyn wasn't done. "There's no shame in it," she continued. "No shame in needing people, in wanting to be needed. Your wife, if she loved you, wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life alone on this mountain, punishing yourself for the crime of surviving when she didn't." "You didn't know her," Gideon said, his voice tight. "You don't know what she'd want?" "I know what any woman who truly loves someone would want. For them to live, really live, not just exist." Evelyn's expression softened. "But you're right. I didn't know her. I only know what I see in front of me, a good man who's forgotten how to be good to himself. So if lying about your motivations helps you do the right thing, then lie. I won't call you on it again." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Clara stood frozen between them, her eyes moving from Evelyn to Gideon and back again like she was watching something fragile and dangerous unfold. Finally, Gideon spoke. "I'm going scouting. We'll discuss my motivations another time, or preferably never." He left before either woman could respond, stepping out into the blinding white world and closing the door firmly behind him. The cold hit him like a physical blow, so sharp and clean it almost hurt. He stood there for a moment, breathing it in, letting it clear his head of Evelyn's too accurate observations and his own complicated feelings. Then he started walking, following the terrain he knew by heart, looking for signs of the men who were hunting the two women he'd decided to protect. The snow had transformed the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. What had been familiar trails were now buried under drifts that came up to Gideon's waist in places. The trees bowed under the weight of snow, some of them bent nearly double, and every so often one would release its burden in a soft whump that sounded unnervingly like footsteps. He found the first sign of the hunters about a mile down the mountain, tracks, partially filled in by yesterday's final snowfall, but still visible. 4 sets, just like Evelyn had said. They were moving slowly, carefully, spreading out in a search pattern that suggested at least one of them knew what they were doing. Probably this Thomas Kerr she'd mentioned, the ex-bounty hunter. Gideon followed the tracks at a distance, using the trees for cover, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd learned to hunt both animals and men. The trail led him to a small hollow where the hunters had made camp, sheltering under a rock overhang that provided some protection from the elements. They'd built a fire, the smoke still visible as a thin gray line against the sky. Smart enough to keep it small, but not smart enough to go without entirely. That told him they were experienced outdoorsmen, but not military, not trained in the kind of invisible tracking he'd learned during the war. He circled their camp at a distance, counting 4 bedrolls, various supplies, weapons propped against rocks. The men themselves were still there. He could hear voices, see movement. They were preparing to move out, getting ready to continue their search now that the storm had passed. Gideon memorized everything, their numbers, their weapons, their level of organization, the way they moved and spoke to each other. One man clearly led the others, tall and lean, with a hardness to his movements that spoke of violence comfortably worn. That would be Kerr. The other 3 were followers, dangerous because of their zealotry, but not particularly skilled. He'd fought worse odds during the war, but that was years ago, and he'd been younger then, faster, and most importantly, he'd had an army at his back. Now it was just him, a wounded woman, and Clara, with her fierce eyes and no real combat experience. Not great odds, but not impossible either. He was preparing to head back when he heard Kerr speak, his voice carrying in the still mountain air. "We'll split up. Jonas, you and Pete take the eastern ridge. Micah and I will search west. They came up this mountain, we know that much. Can't have gone far in that storm, not with the row woman injured." "What if they found shelter?" one of the other men asked. "There's caves, old cabins, could be anywhere." "Then we search them all." Kerr's voice was flat, patient. "However long it takes. The Reverend wants them brought back to face judgment, and that's what we'll do. The town's counting on us." "What if they resist?" There was a pause, and when Kerr spoke again, Gideon could hear the smile in his voice. "Then we'll drag them back in whatever condition we find them in. Dead women can't cast curses, can they?" The other men laughed. and the sound of it, casual, comfortable cruelty, made Gideon's hand tighten on his rifle. These weren't lawmen doing their duty. These were hunters who'd found prey they felt righteous about killing, and that made them more dangerous than simple mercenaries ever could be. He'd heard enough. Moving with careful silence, he made his way back through the snow, covering his tracks as he went, using tricks learned from a lifetime of hunting. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was fully up, and the world had warmed enough that the snow was starting to develop a crust that would make travel even more difficult. Clara met him at the door, anxiety clear on her face. "Well?" "4 men camped about a mile east. They're splitting up to search, which works in our favor. We'll lay the false trail west, make it look like you headed for the high passes. They'll follow it, waste most of the day, and by the time they figure out it's a dead end, you'll have had time to rest and we'll have time to plan the next move." "How long do we have?" "Hours, if we're lucky, so let's not waste them." The next few hours passed in focused activity. Gideon took Clara west, away from the cabin, breaking trail through the snow with deliberate carelessness. They left signs that would read as 2 women moving in exhausted desperation, dropped items, places where someone had clearly stumbled and fallen, even a scrap of fabric torn on a branch that Clara provided from one of Evelyn's petticoats. "You're good at this," Clara observed, watching him work. "Creating lies that look like truth. I'm good at surviving. Sometimes that requires deception." They continued laying the trail until they reached a rocky area where the wind had blown most of the snow clear. There, Gideon made it look like the women had turned north, heading toward a series of treacherous passes that no sane person would attempt in winter. The hunters would follow, realize it was impossible terrain, and hopefully assume their prey had died in an attempt to cross it. "Will they believe it?" Clara asked as they carefully backtracked, Gideon using a pine branch to sweep away their return tracks. "Probably not entirely, but it'll buy time, and time is what we need." When they finally made it back to the cabin, Gideon felt the exhaustion of the morning's work settling into his bones. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and the combination of little sleep and hard travel was taking its toll, but there was no time to rest. They needed to prepare for the possibility that the hunters wouldn't be fooled, that they'd come to the cabin anyway. He spent the afternoon checking his weapons, inventorying ammunition, showing Clara how to load and fire his spare rifle. She learned quickly, her hand steady and sure on the weapon despite her obvious nervousness. "I've never shot at a person before," she said quietly, sighting down the barrel at an imaginary target. "Hopefully you won't have to, but if it comes to it, if they try to take Evelyn, you aim center mass and you don't hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed." "Have you? Shot people, I mean?" "During the war, yes." Gideon didn't elaborate, and Clara didn't push. Some things didn't need explaining, their weight evident in the silence they created. Evelyn, meanwhile, had insisted on being useful despite her injuries. She'd taken over cooking duties, moving slowly but competently around the small kitchen, preparing a stew from Gideon's supplies that filled the cabin with warmth and rich smells. Watching her work, seeing the careful way she moved, the stubborn set of her shoulders that refused to acknowledge pain, Gideon found himself understanding what Clara had meant about family. This wasn't blood relation, wasn't the family you were born into. This was the family you chose, the family you built from shared survival and mutual care. He'd had that once, with Sarah, had lost it when she died. And now, against all odds and better judgment, he was finding it again with 2 women he'd known for less than a week. Evening fell, and with it came the tension of waiting. The hunters hadn't appeared, which meant either the false trail had worked or they were being more cautious than expected. Gideon kept watch at the window, rifle close, while Clara and Evelyn talked in low voices by the fire. He caught fragments of their conversation, memories of Sterling Falls, people they'd known, the life they'd lost. There was grief in their voices, but also something else, something that sounded almost like relief, as if being cast out, as terrible as it had been, had also freed them from something they hadn't even known was a cage. "You ever think about what comes next?" Clara asked Evelyn. "After this? Assuming we survive?" "I try not to think too far ahead. Seems presumptuous." "But if we do? If we get away? Where would we go?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Somewhere new, somewhere they don't know us, don't know the stories. maybe west to one of the mining camps or railroad towns, somewhere we could start over. Would they even let us? 2 women alone, no husbands, no family? We'd make them let us. We'd be useful, valuable. We'd survive, like we always do. Evelyn's voice held a note of steel. I won't let them break me, Clara. I won't give them that satisfaction. We'll build a new life, better than the one they took from us. Listening to them, Gideon felt something shift inside him. All this time, he'd been thinking about helping them escape, helping them survive. But he hadn't really considered what came after, whether they'd leave and he'd return to isolation, or whether something else might be possible. The thought of the cabin returning to its previous emptiness, to the silence and solitude that had been his only companions for 12 years, suddenly seemed unbearable. These past few days, despite the danger and uncertainty, had reminded him what it meant to be part of something larger than his own survival, to care about someone else's well-being, to have people who depended on him, and people he could depend on in return. He was still wrestling with these thoughts when Clara appeared at his shoulder, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She offered him one, then stood beside him at the window, looking out at the darkening forest. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. For not turning us away, for protecting us, for giving us a chance when everyone else decided we were worthless. You're not worthless." "No, but it's nice to have someone else believe that too." She sipped her coffee, her profile thoughtful in the fading light. "Evelyn and we've been talking about what happens if we survive this. And we were wondering if maybe we didn't have to leave, if maybe there was a way to stay." Gideon's heart did something complicated in his chest. "Stay here? On the mountain?" "Not here specifically. We know this is your place, your sanctuary, but maybe nearby. Maybe we could build something, the 3 of us. A real home, not just a hiding place." She turned to look at him fully. "You've been alone a long time, Gideon, maybe too long, and we've been cast out by people who were supposed to care about us. Maybe we all deserve something better than that. It's not that simple. Why not? Because people will talk? People already think we're witches and you're a ghost. Let them talk. Because it'll be hard? We're used to hard. Because it's not proper. Proper is overrated, and it certainly never did any of us any favors." Gideon wanted to argue, wanted to list all the reasons why what she was suggesting was impossible. But standing there in the growing dark with Clara beside him, and Evelyn's presence warm at his back, and the cabin full of life for the first time in 12 years, he couldn't make the words come. Instead, he said, "Let's survive the next few days first. Then we can talk about futures." Clara smiled, and it transformed her face from pretty to beautiful. "That's not a no. It's not a yes either. But it's not a no. I'll take it." She squeezed his arm once, briefly, then returned to Evelyn by the fire. Gideon watched them settle in together, Clara's hand finding Evelyn's, their heads bent close in conversation. Through the window, the stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant and eternal. And in that moment, standing guard over 2 women who'd stumbled into his life and cracked it open, Gideon Thorne felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. He felt hope. It was terrifying and fragile and probably foolish. But it was real, and it was his, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone take it away. That hope lasted exactly 18 hours. Gideon woke to the sound of breaking glass and Clara's scream, his body moving before his mind fully caught up, rifle in his hands and feet hitting the floor in the same motion. Dawn was just breaking, that gray, uncertain light that made everything look washed out and unreal. Through the shattered window he could see movement, shapes in the trees, at least 3 of them, maybe more. "Get down!" he shouted, and both women dropped without hesitation. A bullet punched through the door, splintering wood, and Gideon returned fire through the broken window, not aiming to hit, but to make them think twice about a direct assault. "The back window," Evelyn said, her voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "There's someone there too." Gideon cursed. They were surrounded, or close to it. The false trail had failed, or they'd seen through it faster than he'd hoped. Either way, the hunters had found them, and now they were trapped. "How many?" Clara asked, crawling across the floor to where Gideon had stashed the spare rifle. "At least 4, probably the same 4 from their camp. They've got us pinned." Gideon's mind was racing, calculating angles and odds, and none of them good. The cabin was defensible, but not indefinitely. They had ammunition, but not unlimited supplies. And the hunters knew they had women inside, knew their targets couldn't run far. Another shot came through the window, this one closer, and Gideon heard a man's voice call out, "Gideon Thorne! We know you're harboring fugitives. Send them out and we'll leave you in peace. You've got 5 minutes to decide." "That's Kerr," Evelyn said quietly. "The bounty hunter." Gideon didn't answer, just kept his eyes on the trees, looking for movement, for targets. His heart was hammering, but his hands were steady. Muscle memory from the war kicking in, the part of him that had learned to function in chaos and terror. "What do we do?" Clara had the rifle now, holding it like he'd taught her, but her face was pale and her eyes too wide. "We don't do anything," Evelyn said before Gideon could answer. "I go out there. I tell them Clara escaped during the night, that Gideon was just offering shelter to a sick woman and didn't know who I was. They'll take me and leave you both alone." "The hell they will," Gideon said flatly. "You think they'll just accept that story and ride off into the sunset? You think they won't burn this cabin down out of spite or shoot me just for the crime of helping you?" "He's right," Clara added, her voice shaking but determined. "We're past the point of negotiation. They came here to kill us or drag us back, and they won't leave witnesses." 4 minutes, Kerr called out. Gideon made a decision. There's a root cellar. Entrance is hidden under that rug by the bed. It leads to a tunnel that comes out about 50 yards north, behind that big deadfall pine. You can see it from here. He pointed through the window at the fallen tree, massive and snow-covered. "You both go. Now. I'll hold them here. Make them think we're all still inside. Once you're clear, you run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run." "No," Clara said simply. "This isn't a discussion. You're right. It isn't." Clara's eyes had gone hard, that fierce wounded animal look back in full force. "Because we're not leaving you to die alone defending us. We're not doing to you what everyone did to us, abandoning you the moment it gets dangerous. I can hold them longer if I'm not worrying about you two. And we can fight better if there's 3 rifles instead of 1, Evelyn interrupted. She'd crawled to the weapons cache, was loading a pistol with hands that barely shook. "I may be old and injured, but I can still shoot. My father made sure his daughters knew how to handle firearms, said the frontier was no place for helpless women. 3 minutes." Gideon looked between them, saw the absolute determination in their faces, and felt something inside him crack open wider. They were choosing him, choosing to stay and fight beside him even though running would give them better odds of survival. Choosing loyalty over self-preservation. It had been 12 years since anyone had chosen him for anything. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "All right. Clara, you take the back window. Evelyn, you stay low and cover the door. I'll handle the front. We make them pay for every inch they try to take, and we do not let them get inside. Understood?" They both nodded, and then they were moving, taking positions, checking weapons, doing everything right because somehow, in the past few days, they'd become a unit, a team, something that functioned together despite barely knowing each other. The last minute ticked away in tense silence, broken only by the sounds of them preparing, the click of rifles being loaded, the rustle of fabric as they settled into positions, breathing that tried to stay steady and mostly succeeded. Then Kerr's voice came again, different this time, harder. "Time's up, Thorne. We're coming in." "Then come," Gideon called back, and fired a shot that splintered bark inches from where he'd seen movement. "But some of you won't walk back down this mountain." The attack came fast and from multiple angles. 2 men rushed the front, using trees for cover, firing as they came. Another tried the back where Clara was positioned. The fourth, Kerr, Gideon assumed, hung back, directing the assault with the calm competence of someone who'd done this before. Gideon fired, reloaded, fired again. Beside him, Evelyn's pistol barked twice and he heard one of the attackers cry out. Clara's rifle roared from the back window, followed by cursing and the sound of someone crashing through underbrush in retreat. "I hit him!" Clara shouted, her voice high with adrenaline and maybe fear. "I think I hit him!" "Good," Gideon called back. "Keep hitting them." But even as he said it, he knew this couldn't last. They were outnumbered, and the hunters had unlimited time to press the attack. Sooner or later, someone would get close enough to throw a torch through the window, or they'd just wait until dark and burn the cabin with all of them inside. This was a delaying action at best, not a winning strategy. They needed to break the siege, needed to change the equation somehow. But how? The answer came from an unexpected direction. During a brief lull in the shooting, Gideon heard Evelyn say, "The tunnel. We use it, but not to escape. We use it to flank them." Gideon's head snapped around to look at her. "That's insane." "Is it? They think we're all trapped in here. They're not watching their backs. One of us could get behind them, force them to divide their attention." Her eyes were bright, calculating. "I know I'm the logical choice. I'm the slowest, the most injured. I'd be least useful in a straight fight, but I can crawl through that tunnel and I can shoot a man in the back if it means saving the people I love." "Evelyn, no," Clara started, but the older woman cut her off. "Yes, it's the only play we have that changes the odds." She looked at Gideon. "You know I'm right." He did. He hated it, but he did. And the fact that she'd called Clara and him the people she loved wasn't lost on him, wasn't something he could ignore. 5 minutes, he said. "You get in position, you wait for my signal. I'll draw their attention, make noise, get them focused on the front. Then you shoot whoever's closest, and we press the advantage. But Evelyn," he caught her eyes, held them. "You miss, you hesitate. You get caught. This whole thing falls apart. You sure you can do this?" "I taught school for 26 years, Evelyn said with a thin smile. "I faced down rooms full of hostile children and parents who thought they knew better than me how to educate their offspring. I've endured town councils and church committees and every small-minded fool who thought a woman had no business having opinions. I think I can manage 4 men with guns." Despite everything, Gideon almost smiled. "Then go, and be careful." Evelyn moved to the hidden entrance, Clara helping her lift the rug and open the concealed door. The tunnel beneath was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Evelyn looked at it, looked back at them, and for just a second the fear showed through her brave facade. "I'll see you both on the other side," she said. "You better," Clara replied, her voice breaking. Then Evelyn was gone, swallowed by darkness and earth, and Clara was pulling the door closed behind her and replacing the rug. They both returned to their positions, and the waiting began. It was the longest 5 minutes of Gideon's life. Outside, the hunters had pulled back, regrouping, probably planning their next assault. Inside, he and Clara held their positions and tried not to think about what could go wrong, about all the ways this desperate plan could end with all of them dead. "She'll make it," Clara said, as much to herself as to him. "She's stronger than she looks. Stronger than anyone gives her credit for." "I know. If she doesn't, if something happens to her, I'll never forgive myself. She's only here because of me, because she defended me when no one else would. If something happens to her, it'll be because of the men out there, not because of you," Gideon said firmly. "Don't carry guilt for other people's cruelty, Clara. That's a weight that'll break you." Before she could respond, he saw movement through the trees, the hunters regrouping for another assault. It was time. "Get ready," he called. Then louder, projecting his voice so it would carry, "Kerr, you want to talk terms?" There was a pause, then the bounty hunter's voice came back, cautious. "What kind of terms?" "The kind where nobody else has to die today. You've got men hit, probably bleeding. We've got ammunition and defensible position. This could go on all day, and at the end of it you might win, but you'll pay a price. Or we could negotiate." Another pause. Gideon could imagine Kerr calculating, weighing odds. "What are you proposing?" "Safe passage for me and the girl. The old woman stays. You take her back to face whatever judgment you think she deserves. We walk away. You get what you came for. Everyone lives." He hated the words even as he spoke them, hated using Evelyn as bait. But he needed to buy her time, needed to get the hunters focused on the cabin and the possibility of negotiation. "How do I know you're not lying?" Kerr called back. "How do I know you won't shoot us the moment we step outside?" Gideon countered. "I guess we're both taking things on faith." He could hear them conferring, voices too low to make out words. Then Kerr again. "Show me the old woman. Prove you've still got her." That was the moment, the signal Evelyn was waiting for. Gideon counted to 5 in his head, then shouted back, "You want proof? Come and... The shot cracked through the morning air, sharp and final. Gideon heard a man scream, heard cursing and confusion from the hunter's position. Evelyn had made her move. Now! Gideon shouted to Clara, and they both opened up with everything they had, pouring fire into the trees where the hunters had been grouped. The element of surprise was total. The hunters had been focused on the cabin, hadn't expected an attack from behind. Another shot from Evelyn's position, another cry of pain. The hunters broke, running for better cover, their assault completely shattered. Gideon burst out the door, rifle up, and saw one man down and bleeding, another limping badly, Kerr himself diving behind a boulder with a curse. Clara was right behind him, her rifle firing with methodical precision despite her shaking hands. She wasn't hitting much, but she was making the hunters keep their heads down, and that was enough. Then Evelyn appeared, emerging from behind the deadfall pine like some avenging spirit, her face set in hard lines and her pistol still smoking. She'd hit 2 men, wounded both of them, and completely reversed the tactical situation in under a minute. But Kerr was already adapting. Gideon saw him pop up from behind his cover, saw the rifle coming to bear not on Gideon but on Evelyn, saw what was about to happen with the terrible clarity of combat-sharpened instincts. He didn't think, just moved, throwing himself between Evelyn and Kerr's rifle, and the bullet meant for her took him in the shoulder instead. The impact spun him around, pain like white fire exploding through his body, and he went down hard in the snow. Gideon! Clara's scream seemed to come from very far away. He heard more shooting, heard Evelyn's voice raised in fury, heard the sounds of the hunters retreating through the forest. But it all felt distant, filtered through the roaring in his ears and the spreading numbness in his shoulder. Then Clara and Evelyn were there, hands on him, voices urgent and scared. He tried to tell them he was fine, that it wasn't bad, but when he looked down and saw the blood spreading across his coat, dark and hot against the white snow, he wasn't entirely sure that was true. We need to get him inside, Evelyn was saying, her teacher's voice cutting through the chaos. Now, before they regroup. They half carried, half dragged him back to the cabin, and Gideon's boots left twin trails of red in the pristine snow. Inside, they got him into the chair, and Evelyn's hands, surprisingly steady despite everything, began cutting away his coat and shirt to get at the wound. Is it bad? Clara asked, her face white with fear. The bullet went through. That's good. We don't have to dig it out. Evelyn was already packing the wound with clean cloth, her movements efficient despite the shakiness that had to be setting in. But he's losing blood fast and there's a risk of infection. We need to cauterize it. No, Gideon managed, his voice coming out weaker than he'd like. Just bind it tight. We don't have time for... We'll make time, Evelyn said firmly. You just threw yourself in front of a bullet for me, Gideon Thorne. The least I can do is make sure you don't die from it. The cauterization was every bit as terrible as Gideon remembered from the war. The heated knife blade, the smell of his own flesh burning, the pain that made his vision go white around the edges. But Evelyn's hands never wavered, and Clara held him down with surprising strength while he gritted his teeth and tried not to scream. When it was over, he sagged back in the chair, sweat-soaked and shaking but alive. The wound was sealed, the bleeding stopped, and barring infection, he'd probably survive. They'll be back, he said once he could speak again. Kerr's not the type to give up. He'll get his wounded to safety, and then he'll come back with reinforcements. Then we leave, Clara said. Now, before they can regroup, you said there's an old refuge higher up the mountain? Gideon nodded, each movement sending fresh pain through his shoulder. Old Trapper's cabin, about 8 miles north in the high country. Abandoned for years, but the structure was solid last time I saw it. If we can make it there, we can defend it better than this place. Can you walk 8 miles in your condition? Evelyn asked, her eyes shrewd. Can you? Gideon shot back. Fair point. Bishi. She managed a thin smile. I suppose we're all running on stubbornness and spite at this point. Might as well see how far that takes us. They gathered what they could carry. Weapons, ammunition, food, blankets, medical supplies. Gideon watched through waves of pain and exhaustion as the 2 women transformed from frightened refugees into something harder, more capable. Clara moved with purpose now, her earlier fear burned away by action. Evelyn, despite her own injuries and the fact that she'd just shot 2 men, packed with the same methodical efficiency she probably used to organize her classroom. "We need to destroy the tunnel entrance," Gideon said. "Make sure they can't use it to surprise anyone else who might come here." Clara nodded and spent 5 minutes collapsing the tunnel with strategic kicks to the support beams, then piling furniture over the hidden door. By the time she was done, no one would know it had ever existed. The sun was fully up now, the sky a hard, brilliant blue that promised cold clarity and no mercy. They stepped out into the snow, 3 wounded people beginning an 8-mile journey through brutal terrain with armed men somewhere behind them. Gideon took one last look at the cabin that had been his home for 12 years. Blood stained the snow around it. His blood and the hunter's mixed together. Bullet holes pocked the walls and broken glass glittered in the window frames. It looked like what it was, a battlefield. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said quietly, following his gaze. "Sorry we brought this to your door." "Don't be." Gideon turned away from the cabin, turned toward the high country and whatever waited there. "I was already dead here, just too stubborn to lie down. Maybe this is what I needed, something worth fighting for besides my own solitude." They started walking, breaking trail through the deep snow, with Gideon in the lead despite his wound, using his knowledge of the terrain to find the easiest paths. Behind them, the cabin grew smaller, became a speck, then vanished entirely behind the trees and the mountain's curves. The first 2 miles were brutal but manageable. The snow was deep, but the cold had put a crust on it that sometimes held their weight and sometimes didn't, making each step a gamble. Gideon's shoulders screamed with every movement, the pain a constant grinding presence that made his vision blur and his stomach churn. But he kept moving, kept pushing, because stopping meant dying, and he decided somewhere in the chaos of the morning that he wasn't quite ready for that. Clara and Evelyn flanked him, one on each side, ready to catch him if he fell. They didn't talk much. The exertion and altitude made conversation difficult, but their presence was steady, constant. They'd become a unit, the 3 of them, bound together by violence and choice, and something that felt increasingly like family. Around mile 3, Evelyn stumbled and went down hard. Clara was there instantly, helping her up, checking her over. The older woman's face was gray with exhaustion, her breathing labored. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're not," Clara said. "None of us are. But we keep going anyway because that's what we do." "Eloquent," Evelyn managed, a ghost of her dry humor surviving even here. "I had a good teacher." They pushed on. The terrain grew steeper, more treacherous. Gideon had to make decisions constantly, which path to take, where to cross the exposed areas, how to avoid the sections where avalanche danger was highest. Every choice mattered. Every mistake could kill them. Mile 5 brought them to a narrow defile between 2 rock faces, a natural choke point that made Gideon's tactical instincts scream warnings. But the alternative was adding 3 miles to their journey, and none of them had 3 miles left in them. "Stay close," he said, leading them into the gap. "Watch for loose rock." They were halfway through when they heard it, the sound of pursuit. Voices carried on the cold air, still distant but closing. The hunters had regrouped faster than expected. "They're coming," Clara said, stating the obvious because sometimes fear needed to be spoken aloud to be managed. "Then we move faster," Gideon replied, and despite the fire in his shoulder and the weakness creeping into his limbs, he increased the pace. The defile ended and opened onto a vast snowfield that swept up toward the high peaks. The old trapper's cabin was somewhere on the far side, nestled against a cliff face that would provide both shelter and defensibility. But between them and safety lay half a mile of exposed terrain with no cover and nowhere to hide. They'd be visible targets for anyone following, sitting ducks in the snow. Gideon looked back, saw Clara's exhausted face and Evelyn's determination burning in eyes sunken with fatigue, and made another decision. "I'll create a diversion," he said. "Draw them east while you 2 head straight for the cabin. There's an old mine shaft about a 1/4 mile that way." He pointed. "I'll lead them there, lose them in the tunnels, then circle back to meet you." "No," Clara said instantly. "We stay together." "If we stay together, they catch us in the open. This gives you a chance." "I said no." Her voice was steel. "We've had this argument already, Gideon. We're not leaving you, so either come up with a better plan or accept that we're all crossing that snowfield together. And we all survive, or we all die. But we do it as a family. The word hung in the cold air between them, heavy with meaning. Family. Not just a figure of speech, but a declaration, a choice, a line drawn in snow and blood that said these three people belong to each other now, for better or worse. Gideon felt something in his chest tighten and release all at once, like a fist unclenching after holding tight for years. "All right," he said. "Together then. But we run, and we don't stop for anything. Understood?" They understood. The crossing was a nightmare of exposed vulnerability and desperate speed. They ran through snow that grabbed at their legs, across terrain that offered no shelter, while behind them the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer. Gideon could feel eyes on his back, imagined rifles being raised and aimed, and every second expected the crack of gunfire and the impact of bullets. But the shots, when they came, fell short. The hunters were still too far back, the range too great even for skilled marksmen. The bullets kicked up snow in their wake, little geysers of white that marked near misses and desperate attempts. "Keep going!" Gideon shouted, though his own lungs were burning and his legs felt like they were made of lead. Blood had soaked through the bandage on his shoulder, turning his shirt dark. But there was no time to stop, no time to rest. The cliff face loomed ahead, dark rock jutting up through the snow, and nestled against it like something grown from the stone itself was the cabin. Old, weathered, but still standing, a small miracle of frontier construction and stubborn endurance. They covered the last 100 yards in a stumbling sprint that was more desperation than speed, crashed through the door, and Gideon immediately began barricading it with everything he could move. Clara was already at the window, rifle ready, while Evelyn collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving with the effort of breathing at this altitude after the run. "How long do we have?" Clara asked. Gideon looked out the window, saw figures emerging from the tree line, spreading out to approach from multiple angles. 4 men, all still alive despite Evelyn's earlier shooting. They'd tended their wounded and kept coming, driven by conviction and cruelty in equal measure. "Minutes," he said. "They're not going to make the same mistake twice. They'll come hard and fast, try to overrun us before we can organize a defense. Then we better organize fast." Evelyn had recovered enough to move, was already checking their ammunition, counting what they had left. "We've got maybe 40 rounds total, not enough for a prolonged siege." "Won't need to be prolonged," Gideon said grimly. "One way or another, this ends today." And it would. He could feel it, that certainty that came sometimes in combat when you knew the moment of decision was approaching, when all the running and planning and desperate improvisation came down to a single point of crisis that would determine everything. Outside, the hunters were taking positions, using the rocks and sparse trees for cover, preparing their assault. Inside, 3 people who'd become family prepared to make their stand, knowing that survival was far from guaranteed but choosing to fight anyway because that's what family did. They fought for each other. Gideon checked his rifle one more time, met Clara's eyes across the small cabin, saw his own determination reflected there. Evelyn settled into position with her pistol, her face calm despite everything, and for a moment Gideon saw her as she must have been in her classroom, composed, unshakable, refusing to be intimidated by those who thought they had power over her. The attack would come soon. But for this one moment before the storm, there was only the 3 of them, breathing in rhythm, ready to face whatever came together. And somehow, despite all the blood and pain and fear, that felt like enough. The first shot shattered the window before any of them had time to brace for it. Glass exploded inward in a shower of fragments that caught the light like scattered diamonds, and Clara jerked back with a cry, blood blooming across her cheek where a shard had caught her. She didn't drop the rifle, didn't even lower it, just wiped the blood away with her sleeve and kept her position. "Contact left," Gideon called, returning fire through the broken window. He caught a glimpse of movement behind a boulder and sent 3 quick shots that way, forcing whoever it was to duck back down. His shoulder screamed with each recoil, the cauterized wound threatening to tear open, but he ignored it. Pain was just information, and right now survival mattered more than comfort. Evelyn's pistol barked from her position near the door, and Gideon heard someone curse outside. "Got one in the leg," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "He's down but not out." "Make him count his bullets," Gideon replied, firing again to keep the hunters pinned. "They know we're low on ammunition. They're going to try to wait us out. make us waste shots. But the hunters weren't being patient. Another window shattered, this one on the cabin's west side, and bullets began chewing into the old wood walls with methodical precision. They were trying to weaken the structure, create openings, turn the cabin from shelter into a death trap. Clara shifted position, firing through the new opening, and Gideon saw her hands were steady now, the initial shock burned away by necessity. She'd gone from someone who'd never shot at a person to someone holding a firing line in the space of hours, and the transformation spoke to the kind of strength that lived beneath her fierce exterior. "They're spreading out," she called, "trying to surround us." "Let them," Gideon said, ejecting spent shells and reloading with practiced speed. "The more spread out they are, the harder it is for them to concentrate their fire. Just keep them honest. Don't let anyone get close." For the next 10 minutes, the cabin became a small pocket of hell carved into the mountain's side. Gunfire echoed off the cliff face, amplified and distorted until it sounded like an entire war being fought, instead of just 7 people trying to kill each other. Smoke from the weapons filled the small space, making eyes water and throats burn. Shell casings littered the floor, rolling and clinking with each movement. Gideon's world narrowed to the fundamentals: target, aim, fire, reload. Target, aim, fire, reload. The rhythm of combat, the terrible mathematics of violence where every shot mattered and every second counted. He could feel the blood loss making him lightheaded, could feel his hands starting to shake with more than just adrenaline, but he pushed through it because stopping meant dying, and he'd already decided that wasn't happening today. Then Evelyn's pistol clicked empty, the sound somehow louder than all the gunfire, and she looked at Gideon with eyes that held acceptance of what that meant. "I'm out," she said simply. "Take my spare." Gideon pulled his revolver from his belt and slid it across the floor to her. 6 shots, maybe 7 if he'd loaded it full. Not much, but better than nothing. A lull descended over the fight as if both sides had agreed on an intermission. The hunters had pulled back, regrouping, and inside the cabin the 3 defenders caught their breath and assessed their situation. It wasn't good. They had maybe 15 rounds left total. The walls were shot to pieces, letting in wind and cold that would kill them as surely as bullets if they stayed here long enough. And Gideon could see exhaustion settling over Clara and Evelyn like a physical weight, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that came from being pushed past human limits. "We can't keep this up," Clara said, voicing what they were all thinking. "Sooner or later we run out of ammunition, or they rush us all at once, or they wait for dark and burn us out," Evelyn finished. "They have options. We don't." Gideon looked at the 2 women who'd become his family in the space of a week, saw the determination still burning in them despite everything, and felt that earlier decision solidify into absolute certainty. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let these men take them, not while he still drew breath. "There's one option," he said slowly. "The mine shaft I mentioned earlier. It's not far, maybe 300 yards due east. If we can make it there, the tunnels branch in a dozen directions. They'd never find us in the dark, and there are exits that come out miles away." "That's 300 yards of open ground," Clara said. "They'd cut us down before we made it halfway." "Not if someone stays behind to cover you." Gideon met her eyes, saw understanding dawn there, followed immediately by rejection. "No. We've been through this." "This is different," Gideon cut her off. "This isn't about noble sacrifice or me trying to be a hero. This is tactics, pure and simple. One person with a rifle in the high ground can hold 4 men for the time it takes 2 people to cross 300 yards. But 3 people trying to run together? We all die." "Then I'll stay," Evelyn said. "I'm the slowest, the one holding you both back. Let me do something useful." "You can't shoot a rifle with your injuries," Gideon said, not unkindly. "And Clara needs you, needs someone who won't let her do something stupid when this is over. Someone who will make sure she actually builds a life instead of just surviving." "And what about what I need?" Clara's voice was sharp, angry, hurt. "You think I need to watch another person I care about die? You think I can just run away while you throw yourself on a pyre for us?" "I'm not dying today," Gideon said, and he said it with enough conviction that he almost believed it himself. "I'm buying you time. Big difference. Once you're clear, I follow. Use the tunnels, come out the eastern exit, circle back. We meet up after, find a new place, start over, together." The word landed between them heavy with promise and hope, and all the things they'd barely begun to acknowledge. Together. Not just for survival, but for whatever came after, for building something real and lasting from the ashes of their separate tragedies. Evelyn was watching them both with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're a terrible liar, Gideon Thorne. You and I both know the odds of you making it out of here alive are slim to none." "Then I guess I better beat the odds." He managed a smile that felt like it might crack his face. Wouldn't be the first time. Before either woman could argue further, a voice called from outside. Kerr, of course. The man seemed to have endless reserves of patience and persistence. "Thorne, I'll give you one more chance. Send out the women and we let you live. You can go back to your mountain, your solitude. This doesn't have to be your fight." Gideon moved to the window, keeping low, and shouted back, "Here's my counteroffer, Kerr. You and your men turn around and walk away, and I don't put bullets in each of you the way you deserve. You came here hunting innocent women because some town decided they needed a scapegoat for a baby's death. That makes you worse than any criminal I ever met during the war." "Those women are witches and murderers," Kerr replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "The town has spoken, judgment has been passed. We're just the instruments of justice." "Justice," Gideon laughed, and it was a bitter, ugly sound. "You know what justice looks like? It looks like leaving people alone who never did you harm. It looks like not beating a woman half to death because she had the audacity to teach children. Your justice is just mob rule dressed up in righteous language, and I'll die before I let you drag these women back to it." There was a long pause, and when Kerr spoke again, his voice had gone cold. "Then you'll die. We gave you a chance, Hermit. What happens now is on you." Gideon turned away from the window, found Clara and Evelyn watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. "You heard the man. We're out of time for debate, so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to shoot out that back wall, the one that's already half destroyed. You two are going to run for the mine shaft the second it's clear. I'll keep them busy, keep their eyes on the front. You get to the tunnels, you go deep, you don't look back." "That's the plan." "I hate this plan," Clara said, but she was already moving, already helping Evelyn gather what little supplies they could carry. "Join the club." Gideon loaded his rifle, chambered around, and took position near the back wall. 3 well-placed shots and the damaged wood gave way entirely, creating an opening just large enough for a person to fit through. Cold air rushed in, cutting through the smoke and cordite smell. He looked at Clara one more time, really looked at her, trying to memorize the fierce set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, the way she held herself like she was ready to fight the whole world if necessary. "When this is over," he said, "when we meet up again, I'm going to ask you something." "Ask me now," she demanded. "No. Because asking now feels like admitting I might not get another chance, and I'm not ready to admit that." He smiled, and this time it was real. "So you better make sure you survive, because I'll be disappointed if I prepare this whole speech, and you're not around to hear it." Something flickered across Clara's face, fear and hope, and stubborn determination all mixed together. "You better not die, Gideon Thorne. You better not make me grieve someone else I love." The word hung between them, and Gideon felt it settle into his chest like coming home. Love. She'd said it plainly, without artifice or hesitation, and it was the most precious gift anyone had given him in 12 years. "I won't," he promised, and meant it with everything he had. Evelyn stepped forward then, placed one weathered hand on his cheek with surprising gentleness. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing us as people worth saving, for giving an old woman and a scared girl something to believe in again. Whatever happens next, know that you gave us that." Then they were moving, Clara helping Evelyn through the opening in the wall, and Gideon was back at the front window, firing to draw attention, shouting curses at the hunters to keep their focus on him. He saw Clara and Evelyn emerge from the cabin's backside in his peripheral vision, saw them start running through the snow, and his heart was running with them even as his hands kept working the rifle. The hunters spotted them almost immediately. Kerr shouted something, and 2 of his men broke cover, angling to intercept. But Gideon was ready, had anticipated this, and his first shot took one man in the chest and dropped him like a stone. The second man dove for cover, and by the time he emerged, Clara and Evelyn had gained precious yards. "Focus on me," Gideon roared, firing again. "Come on! You want justice? Come take it! I'm right here!" And come they did. Kerr and his remaining men turned their full attention on the cabin, pouring fire into it with the concentrated fury of people who'd been pushed past patience into rage. Bullets tore through the walls, shattered what remained of the windows, filled the air with splinters and dust and the smell of violence. Gideon moved constantly, firing from different positions, making them think there were more defenders than just him. He was bleeding again, could feel hot wetness spreading down his side, but adrenaline was a hell of a drug and it kept him moving when by rights he should have collapsed. Through the chaos, he caught glimpses of Clara and Evelyn, getting closer to the mine shaft, almost there. Just a little more time, just a few more seconds. Then his rifle clicked empty, and he had no more ammunition for it. He dropped it, pulled his knife, and actually laughed because what else could you do when the universe decided to test exactly how far you could be pushed? "I'm out!" he shouted at no one in particular, at the mountain itself maybe. "You hear that? I'm out of bullets, and I'm still standing." Kerr must have heard something in his voice, some note of desperation or finality, because he called for a ceasefire. The shooting stopped, and in the ringing silence that followed, Gideon could hear his own ragged breathing, could hear the wind whistling through the bullet holes in the walls. "Thorn!" Kerr called. "It's over! Come out with your hands up, and we'll make it quick." Gideon looked out the window, saw Clara and Evelyn disappear into the mine shaft's dark entrance, saw them reach safety. The relief that flooded through him was so intense, it actually made him dizzy. They'd made it. Whatever happened to him now, they'd made it. "Here's the thing, Kerr," he called back, his voice stronger than he felt. "You can come in here and get me. You can shoot me, stab me, beat me to death. But those women? They're gone. You'll never find them in those tunnels. And even if you did, you'd have to go through me first, and I promise you that'll cost more than you're willing to pay." "Noble," Kerr said, and there was almost admiration in his voice. "Stupid, but noble. You're really going to die for two witches you met a week ago?" "They're not witches. They're family. And yeah, I am." Gideon braced himself for the rush, for the final assault that would end this one way or another. He gripped his knife, positioned himself where he'd have the best chance of taking at least one of them with him, and made peace with whatever came next. He'd lived 12 years as a ghost, and he was going to die as a man. That felt like a victory all its own. But the rush never came. Instead, impossibly, Gideon heard new voices, rough, unfamiliar, but definitely human. Then gunfire, but not aimed at the cabin. Aimed at the hunters. Kerr's men scattered, returning fire at this new threat, and through the broken window Gideon saw riders emerging from the tree line. 5 of them, maybe 6, heavily armed and riding hard. They opened up on the hunters with the kind of precision that spoke of military training or long experience with violence. The fight lasted maybe 90 seconds. Kerr and his men, already depleted and exhausted, broke under the assault. 2 went down wounded. The other 2, including Kerr himself, ran for the tree line and disappeared into the forest like smoke. Then there was only silence and the sound of horses breathing hard in the cold air. Gideon sagged against the wall, knife still in hand, trying to process what had just happened. Rescue? Reinforcements? He hadn't even known rescue was possible, had resigned himself to a last stand. Now here were strangers who'd turned the tide at the last possible moment. One of the riders dismounted and approached the cabin carefully, hands visible and empty of weapons in a gesture of non-aggression. He was older, maybe 60, with a face carved into hard lines by weather and experience. But his eyes were kind, and when he spoke his voice carried the rough warmth of someone who'd spent a lifetime in wild places. "Gideon Thorn?" he called. "That you in there?" "Who's asking?" Gideon managed, though his voice came out weaker than he'd like. "Name's Jacob Weaver. I'm a trapper, work the territories north of here. I heard shooting, came to investigate, saw what was happening. Looked like you could use some help." Gideon wanted to laugh, to cry, to curse the timing that had brought help just when he'd accepted death. Instead, he just said, "Your timing's impeccable." That's what my wife always said. She'd also say I'm an interfering old fool who can't mind his own business, but she's not here to scold me, so I'll take that as permission. Weaver took a step closer. "You hurt bad?" "Bad enough, but I'll live." Gideon forced himself to stand straight, to not show how close to collapse he actually was. "Those men? They were hunting two women, innocent women who did nothing wrong except scare a town too ignorant to know the difference between tragedy and witchcraft. I figured it was something like that. Towns have a way of turning cruel when they're scared. Weaver glanced back at his companions, who were tending to the wounded hunters with the same efficiency they'd shown in the fight. The women make it to the mine shaft? You saw them? Hard to miss two people running across open snow. Where do the tunnels exit? Gideon told him, and Weaver nodded, already turning to mount his horse. We'll fetch them. Bring them back here. You just sit tight and try not to bleed out before we return. Would be a shame to save you just to have you die of stubbornness. Wait, Gideon called. Why? Why help us? You don't know us, don't owe us anything. Weaver paused, looked back with those kind, weathered eyes. I know what it looks like when someone's making a stand for something that matters. Saw enough of that during the war, and I know what it looks like when people are being persecuted for nothing more than being different. He smiled, and it transformed his hard face into something almost gentle. Besides, any man willing to die for his family deserves a chance to live for them instead. Then he was riding off with two of his companions, heading toward the mine shaft, and Gideon was left alone in the destroyed cabin with his thoughts and the strange floating feeling that came from blood loss and shock and the sudden absence of mortal danger. He'd survived. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectation, he'd survived. And more than that, Clara and Evelyn had survived. They were safe, or would be soon. And the men who'd hunted them were dead or scattered or captured. It felt like a miracle, though Gideon had never been much for believing in those. But what else could you call it? When everything lined up just right, when help arrived at the exact moment it was needed, when the universe decided to show mercy instead of its usual indifference. The other trappers, Weaver had called them his companions, but they moved with the easy coordination of people who'd worked together for years, finished securing the wounded hunters, and began checking the cabin. One of them, a younger man with a scarred face and gentle hands, helped Gideon sit down and began examining his wounds. You're lucky, the man said, redressing the shoulder injury with clean bandages from his pack. Bullet went clean through, no major arteries hit. You'll have a scar and it'll hurt like hell for weeks, but you'll heal. Doesn't feel lucky, Gideon muttered, though in truth it felt like the luckiest thing that had ever happened to him. Lucky is relative. You're alive. Your women are alive. The bad men are running scared. I'd call that lucky. They're not, Gideon started to correct him but stopped. Because they were his women, weren't they? His family. Clara, who'd declared her love even in the face of death. Evelyn, who'd shot men to protect them and called him worthy. They'd chosen him and he'd chosen them, and that made them family in all the ways that mattered. Yeah, he said instead. I guess they are. Time passed in a strange blur of waiting and pain and the slow return of normalcy. The sun tracked across the sky. The cold deepened, and finally, Gideon heard the sound of horses returning. He forced himself to his feet despite the protests of his body and his new caretaker, and stumbled to the cabin's opening. There they were, Clara and Evelyn, mounted behind Weaver and his companions, alive and whole and real. Clara saw him, and her face transformed, all the fear and grief and desperate hope collapsing into relief so profound she actually swayed in the saddle. She was off the horse before it fully stopped, running to him, and Gideon caught her with his good arm and held on like she was the only thing anchoring him to the world. She was crying and laughing at the same time, her hands checking him over, touching his face like she needed the physical confirmation that he was real. You're alive, she kept saying. You're alive! You're alive, you idiot! You're alive! Told you I would be, Gideon said, and his own voice was rough with emotion he'd kept locked away for 12 years. Told you I had something to ask you. Ask me later, Clara said, and kissed him with a fierceness that made his knees weak and his heart race and made him forget entirely about the pain in his shoulder. When they finally broke apart, Evelyn was there, tears streaming down her weathered face, but smiling with a joy that made her look 20 years younger. You impossible, stubborn, wonderful man, she said, and hugged him carefully, mindful of his injuries. You gave us hope, and then you gave us a future. How do we ever repay that? By living, Gideon said simply. By building something good and refusing to let the cruelty of others define you. That's payment enough. Weaver approached then, his companions hanging back to give them space. The hunters we caught are singing now that we've explained the situation. Seems the whole thing in Sterling Falls was built on lies. The baby died of natural causes, but the Reverend wanted a scapegoat to strengthen his hold on the town. Used these women, used fear, used people's worst instincts. He shook his head in disgust. We've got written confessions, testimony, enough to clear your names and see the real criminals answer for what they did. The town won't care, Evelyn said bitterly. They'll believe what they want to believe. Maybe. But the territorial marshal will care. He's a friend of mine, a fair man. I'll make sure he hears the truth. Weaver looked at the three of them, bloodied, exhausted, but unbroken. What will you do now? You're welcome to winter with us. My camp's not far. We've got supplies, shelter, safety. Gideon looked at Clara, then at Evelyn, and saw his own answer reflected in their eyes. We appreciate the offer, and we'll need to take you up on it for a few days while we heal and resupply. But after that, we're going to find our own place. Somewhere high and hidden where the world can't touch us, unless we let it. We're going to build a home. All three of you? One of the other trappers asked, his tone carefully neutral. All three of us, Clara confirmed, and her hand found Gideon's, held tight. We're family now. That's not conventional or proper or probably even legal, but we don't particularly care. We've earned the right to define our own lives. Weaver smiled at that, broad and approving. I like you people. You've got spine. Come on then, let's get you somewhere warm. We can talk about the future once everyone's patched up and fed. They rode back to Weaver's camp in a small caravan. The trappers, the three survivors, and even the captured hunters bound and sullen on their horses. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the snow gold and red and making the world look like something from a dream. That night, sitting around a fire with food in their bellies and safety around them, Gideon finally asked Clara the question he'd been preparing since the cabin. When I said I wanted to build a home with you both, I meant it. Not as a temporary arrangement or a convenience. I mean forever, or as close to forever as people get. Will you stay with me? Will you build that life? Clara's answer was immediate. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Evelyn was quieter, more thoughtful. Are you sure you want an old woman cluttering up your romantic idol? I want a family, Gideon said. A real one. And that means you, Evelyn. You're as much a part of this as Clara or me. So I'm asking you too. Will you stay? Her tears came silently, tracking down her face in the firelight. I've spent my whole life being told I was too much. Too educated, too opinionated, too unmarried. And here you are asking me to be part of something not despite those things, but including them. So yes, Gideon Thorne, yes, I'll stay. Around them, Weaver's trappers pretended not to listen, but Gideon caught the approving nods, the quiet smiles. These were men who'd lived outside society's strictest rules, who understood that family came in many forms, and love didn't always follow conventional paths. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and full of challenges. They'd need to find a new place, establish themselves, deal with whatever legal fallout came from Sterling Falls. But sitting there with Clara's head on his shoulder and Evelyn's hand clasped in his, Gideon felt something he hadn't felt in 12 long years. He felt complete. He felt like he'd finally come home. The healing took longer than any of them expected. Gideon's shoulder wound festered despite Evelyn's careful tending, and for 3 days he burned with fever while Clara sat vigil beside him, changing cold compresses and whispering fierce demands that he not dare die after everything they'd survived. Evelyn's own injuries, the head wound, the bruised ribs, the exhaustion that had been driven so deep into her bones it seemed permanent, required rest that her restless nature fought against at every turn. But Weaver's camp was a good place for recovery. The trappers were rough men who'd chosen solitude over society, but they had a code that valued loyalty and despised injustice. They treated the three refugees not as charity cases, but as fellow survivors, people who'd earned their respect through blood and courage. The camp's cook, a taciturn man named Samuel who'd lost his tongue to frostbite years ago, made sure they ate well. The others took turns keeping watch, making sure no one from Sterling Falls came looking for revenge or resolution. On the 4th day, Gideon's fever broke. He woke to find Clara asleep in a chair beside his cot, her hand still clutching his even in sleep, her face drawn with exhaustion but peaceful. The sight of her there, keeping watch even when her own body was begging for rest, made something in his chest constrict with an emotion he'd thought dead and buried with Sarah. Love. Not the echo of old love or the ghost of what he'd lost, but something new and fierce and entirely its own. He loved this woman who'd stumbled into his life during a blizzard, who'd proven herself braver and stronger than most men he'd known during the war, who'd looked at his isolation and seen not a ghost to be feared, but a man worth saving. "You're staring," Clara murmured without opening her eyes. "I can feel it. Can't help it. You're worth staring at." She opened her eyes then, and the relief that flooded them when she saw him lucid and clear-eyed was so profound it hurt to witness. "Your fever broke." "Seems that way. How long was I out?" 3 days. 3 very long days where I contemplated all the ways I was going to kill you for scaring me if you survived, and all the ways I'd mourn you if you didn't." She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her back. "Evelyn's been helping with the trappers' mending and cooking, says she needs to feel useful, or she'll go mad. I think she just can't stand being still." "Sounds like someone else I know," Gideon said, and Clara had the grace to smile. "Fair point. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Too stubborn to rest, too broken to quit, too—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Too alive," Gideon finished. "After everything, we're still too alive to give up." "Yes, that exactly." Clara's hand tightened in his. "Weaver says the marshal responded to his message. He's coming here to take statements, and he's bringing a judge from the territorial capital. They want to settle this properly, legally, so there's no question about our innocence." "When?" "Any day now. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. The weather's been holding clear." She looked out the tent's opening where winter sunlight was painting the snow brilliant white. "It feels strange, doesn't it? The idea that this might actually end not in running or hiding, but in actual justice?" "Justice is a myth," Gideon said, the cynicism of 12 years alone coloring his words. "At best, we'll get something that looks like it from a distance." "Maybe. But I'll take the appearance of justice over the certainty of persecution." Clara stood, stretched, and then leaned down to kiss his forehead with a tenderness that made him feel simultaneously strong and fragile. "I'm going to tell Evelyn you're awake. She's been worried sick, though she'd never admit it." Left alone, Gideon took stock of his body and his situation. The shoulder was healing, the stitches holding, the infection beaten back by whatever combination of Evelyn's knowledge and his own stubborn refusal to die. His ribs ached from the exertion of the fight. His legs were weak from days in bed, but he was alive and on the mend. That was more than he'd expected when Kerr and his men had cornered them in that cabin. Evelyn appeared in the tent's entrance, backlit by snow glare and looking like some stern frontier prophet come to deliver judgment. But her face softened when she saw him sitting up, and she crossed to his cot with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd spent decades managing children and fools. "Finally decided to rejoin the living, I see," she said, checking his forehead for fever with cool fingers. "You gave us quite a scare, Gideon Thorne." "Wasn't intentional. The best scares never are." She sat in the chair Clara had vacated and for a moment just looked at him with those sharp blue eyes that saw too much. "We need to talk about what happens next, about the practicalities of this life we've all agreed to build together." "All right, let's talk." Evelyn folded her hands in her lap, every inch the schoolteacher about to deliver a lesson. "I've been doing calculations. We have almost no money between the 3 of us. We have no legal claim to any land. We have supplies enough for perhaps a month if we're careful, weapons that are adequate but not extensive, and a situation that's legally complicated at best." "Sounds grim when you lay it out like that." "It is grim, but grim isn't impossible." She leaned forward, her intensity focused like a beam of light. "Weaver has offered us a partnership. His trapping operation spans a huge territory, and he needs people he can trust to manage some of the outlying camps. He's proposing we take over the northernmost operation. There's a valley about 40 miles from here, good water, sheltered, with an existing cabin that needs work but is fundamentally sound. We'd trap, he'd buy the furs at fair prices, and after 2 years we'd have enough saved to buy the land outright if we chose." Gideon absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. And what does he get out of this arrangement besides trappers? The knowledge that someone trustworthy is working territory that's been giving him trouble. Poachers, mostly, moving in on his lines. He needs people who'll stand their ground, who aren't afraid of conflict. Evelyn's smile was thin. I believe we've proven ourselves more than capable on that front. We'd be isolated, cut off from any help if trouble came. We've been isolated before, we survived it. This is different. This is choosing isolation, building a life in it. That's a harder thing than just enduring it. Gideon met her eyes. You've spent your life in towns, around people, teaching children. You sure you want to trade that for a cabin in the wilderness with just Clara and a broken-down hermit for company? That broken-down hermit threw himself in front of a bullet for me, Evelyn said quietly. He treated me like a person worth protecting when an entire town decided I was worthless. And as for Clara, she's the closest thing to a daughter I'll ever have. So yes, Gideon, I'm sure. The question is, are you sure you want us? Want this? Because it won't be easy, and it won't look like any life you've lived before. Gideon thought about his old cabin, about 12 years of solitude that had felt like both prison and sanctuary. Thought about the moment Clara and Evelyn had knocked on his door and shattered that careful isolation. Thought about everything that had happened since, the violence and fear, yes, but also the warmth and connection, the feeling of being part of something larger than his own survival. I'm sure, he said. More sure than I've been about anything since Sarah died. Evelyn nodded, satisfied. Then we have a plan. Once the marshal clears our names, and Weaver seems confident he will, we move to the valley. We build something real. The three of us, against the world if necessary. The three of us, Gideon echoed, and the words felt like a vow. The marshal arrived 2 days later with a contingent of 6 men and Judge Harrison, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who'd made a reputation in the territories for fairness and intolerance of corruption. They set up in Weaver's largest tent, and for 2 days they took statements from everyone involved: Gideon, Clara, Evelyn, the captured hunters, Weaver, and his men who'd witnessed the final confrontation. Clara testified first, her voice steady, as she recounted the death of the Miller baby, the town's descent into hysteria, the beatings and persecution that had driven her and Evelyn into the winter mountains. She didn't cry, didn't plead, just stated facts with the kind of dignity that made several of the marshal's men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Evelyn was next, and her testimony was devastating in its precision. She cataloged every injustice, every cruelty, every failure of the people who should have protected them. But she also spoke with the measured authority of someone who'd spent decades educating young minds, and her credibility was unimpeachable. Gideon's testimony was shorter, more focused on the events at his cabin and the subsequent chase. But when Judge Harrison asked him why he'd chosen to protect 2 women he barely knew, his answer was simple and direct. Because they were innocent and they needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Seemed like that was reason enough. Even at the cost of your own life? The judge pressed. Especially then. What good is survival if you won't risk it for something that matters? The captured hunters tried to maintain their story about witchcraft and righteous judgment, but under Judge Harrison's withering cross-examination, their lies crumbled. Confronted with the testimony of Weaver's men, with the physical evidence of their brutality, with the contradictions in their own accounts, they finally admitted the truth. The Reverend in Sterling Falls had needed a scapegoat to consolidate his power. Evelyn had been too educated, too independent, too willing to challenge his authority. Clara had been guilty by association. The Miller baby's death had been convenient timing, nothing more. On the 3rd day, Judge Harrison delivered her ruling. The tent was packed. Weaver's entire camp had turned out to hear the verdict, along with the marshal's men and even a few curious prospectors who'd heard about the trial and ridden in to witness frontier justice in action. After reviewing all testimony and evidence, Judge Harrison began, her voice carrying easily in the hushed space. I find that Clara Voss and Evelyn Rowe were subjected to unlawful persecution, assault, and attempted murder by citizens of Sterling Falls, acting without legal authority and in violation of territorial law. All charges of witchcraft, murder, and theft are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am issuing arrest warrants for Reverend Marcus Thorne, Mayor William Halstead, and 12 other citizens of Sterling Falls on charges of assault, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder. The tent erupted in noise. Cheers from Weaver's men, protests from the captured hunters, the buzz of astonished conversation. Clara grabbed Evelyn's hand and held on tight, and both women's eyes were bright with tears they refused to let fall. Judge Harrison raised her hand for silence. Additionally, I am awarding Clara Voss and Evelyn Rowe monetary compensation from the town of Sterling Falls in the amount of $500 each to be paid within 30 days, as restitution for their suffering and loss of property. Any attempts to interfere with these women's rights as free citizens will be met with the full force of territorial law. This matter is concluded. She brought down her gavel with a crack like a rifle shot, and just like that it was over. They were free, not just escaped or hidden, but legally, officially, unquestionably free. Gideon watched Clara and Evelyn embrace, watched the relief and joy and disbelief wash over them, and felt his own chest tighten with emotion. Justice had been a myth, he'd said, but here it was, imperfect and complicated, but real nonetheless. Here it was, delivered by a tough frontier judge who'd seen through lies and chose to stand with the powerless against the powerful. Later, after the official proceedings had concluded and the celebration had begun, Clara found him standing outside the tent, looking up at the mountains that had been his home and his prison for so long. "We did it," she said, slipping her hand into his. "We actually did it. We're free." "You're free," Gideon corrected. "I was never under any charges." "No, we're free, all three of us. Free from the past, from the people who hurt us, from the weight of carrying all that pain alone." She leaned her head against his good shoulder. "Evelyn told me about Weaver's offer, about the valley and the cabin. And I think it's perfect. Isolated enough that the world can't easily touch us, but not so isolated we're completely cut off. Work that's honest and hard, but ours. A chance to build something real." She pulled back to look at him. "Is that what you want? Truly?" "What I want," Gideon said slowly, choosing his words with care, "is to wake up every morning knowing I'm part of something good, to have people who need me and people I need back, to stop running from grief and start building towards something better. So yes, Clara, that's what I want. You and Evelyn and a cabin in the wilderness and whatever life we can carve out of this hard country. Even though people will talk, even though what we're building won't look like anything conventional or proper. Let them talk. They've been calling me a ghost for 12 years, calling you a witch, calling Evelyn a threat to their comfortable prejudices. Their opinions lost their power the moment we stopped caring about them." He cupped her face in his hand, rough palm against her cheek. "I love you, Clara Voss. Not because you're convenient or because you happen to be there. I love you because you're fierce and brave and you've got a heart that refuses to break no matter how hard the world tries. And I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you never have to face that world alone again." She kissed him then, long and deep and full of promise. And when they finally broke apart, she was smiling through tears. "I love you too, you impossible man, and I can't wait to build this life with you." They moved to the valley 3 weeks later, once the spring thaw had begun and travel was possible without risking death by exposure. Weaver provided supplies, horses, and 2 of his men to help with the initial journey. The cabin was indeed rough: 1 room, a leaky roof, windows that needed replacing, and a floor that had seen better decades. But it had good bones, and it sat in a valley so beautiful it made Gideon's chest ache. Mountains rose on 3 sides, their peaks still snow-covered even as the valley floor began to show patches of brown earth. A creek ran clear and fast with snowmelt, good for drinking and washing and eventually fishing. Pine and aspen surrounded the cabin, providing both wood and shelter. And the isolation, the precious, chosen isolation, meant they could build their life exactly as they wanted it without the weight of judgment or expectation. The first month was brutally hard. They worked dawn to dusk repairing the cabin, building furniture from rough timber, establishing trap lines, hunting for meat to supplement their supplies. Gideon's shoulder limited what he could do, which frustrated him until Evelyn pointed out that he was perfectly capable of teaching Clara to shoot properly, to read weather signs, to track game through the forest. "You're not useless just because you can't lift logs," she said tartly when he complained. "You've got knowledge worth more than muscle, and Clara needs to learn if she's going to survive here." So he taught, and Clara learned with the same fierce determination she brought to everything. She could track a deer through snow, shoot a rabbit at 50 yards, and read the sky for signs of incoming weather. Evelyn, meanwhile, transformed the cabin's interior from rough shelter to actual home. She made curtains from spare fabric, organized their supplies with ruthless efficiency, and insisted they set aside 1 hour each evening for reading and conversation, because we're not going to become savages just because we live in the wilderness. The money from the settlement arrived in April, delivered by a courier who looked around at their rough camp and obvious poverty with barely concealed disdain. But $500 each was a fortune by frontier standards, enough to buy proper tools, good weapons, warm clothes for the coming winter, and still have savings for emergencies. "We should invest some of this in livestock," Evelyn said, counting the money with careful precision. "Chickens for eggs, maybe a milk cow. We can't rely on hunting and trapping alone." "And we need a proper stove," Clara added, "one that doesn't smoke us out every time the wind changes." Gideon listened to them plan and felt that now familiar tightness in his chest that he'd learned meant contentment, belonging, home. This was his family, not bound by blood or law, but by choice and survival and love. They bickered like siblings, planned like partners, and cared for each other with a ferocity that made the bonds of conventional families seem pale by comparison. Summer brought work of a different kind. They planted a garden, tended the trap lines Weaver had established, hunted and fished and preserved food for the coming winter. The valley revealed itself slowly, offering up wild berries and edible plants, game trails and fishing spots, secret meadows where wildflowers bloomed in riots of color. And they began to attract others. Word had spread about the hermit and the two women who'd defied an entire town in one. Other outcasts, other people who didn't fit conventional molds began appearing at their door. A young couple who'd been cast out for marrying across racial lines, a man who'd fled an abusive family, a woman who'd disguised herself as a man to escape an arranged marriage and wanted to live as her true self. Each time, Gideon would look at Clara and Evelyn, and they'd have the same silent conversation. These were people who needed refuge, who needed a place where they could be safe and accepted. How could they turn them away when they'd once been in the same desperate situation? By the time autumn painted the aspens gold, they had 8 people living in and around the valley. Gideon had insisted they build separate cabins for those who wanted privacy, using the skills he'd learned over 12 years of solitary construction. The valley was becoming a community, small and unconventional, but real. On a clear October evening, with the first frost making the grass crackle underfoot and the mountains glowing pink in the sunset, Gideon stood outside the original cabin and looked at what they'd built. Smoke rose from 4 different chimneys. He could hear laughter from the nearest cabin where the young couple was teaching Evelyn some complicated card game. Claire was in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the hard freeze came. "Quite different from a year ago, isn't it?" Weaver had ridden in that afternoon with supplies and news from the wider world. He stood beside Gideon now, both men watching the little settlement prepare for night. "A year ago, I was alone and convinced that was the only way I could survive," Gideon said. "Now I've got a family, a community, and more reasons to live than I can count. Funny how wrong you can be about what you need." "Sarah would be proud," Weaver said quietly, "of what you've built here, of the man you've become." Gideon was surprised to find the mention of his first wife's name didn't hurt the way it used to. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had been joined by new love, new purpose, new life. Sarah was part of his past, honored and remembered. But Clara and Evelyn and this community were his present and future. "I think she would," he agreed. "I think she'd approve of all of this." Clara appeared at his elbow then, dirt on her hands and satisfaction on her face. "Last harvest is done. We'll eat well this winter." "We'll do more than eat," Evelyn called from the other cabin's door. "We'll thrive. We've built something good here, and winter isn't going to change that." That night, the entire community gathered in the main cabin for dinner. It was crowded and loud and chaotic, people talking over each other and laughing and telling stories. Someone produced a fiddle and music filled the room, and Clara dragged Gideon into something approximating a dance despite his protests that he didn't know how. "You're doing fine," she said, her eyes bright with joy. "Just follow my lead." "Story of my life now," Gideon replied. and meant it as the highest compliment. Later, after everyone had dispersed to their own cabins and the fire had burned down to embers, Gideon sat with Clara and Evelyn in comfortable silence. These moments were his favorites: the quiet after the noise, the peace after the work, the simple fact of being together without needing words. "I've been thinking," Evelyn said eventually, breaking the silence. "We should build a school. Nothing fancy, just a one-room building where I can teach the children that are starting to appear. Young Thomas and Marie are expecting, and I heard whispers that the Johnsons might be as well. We're going to need education." "A school," Gideon repeated, testing the word. "In our little refuge for outcasts. Especially here. These children are going to grow up different, outside conventional society. They'll need knowledge even more than town children do. They'll need to understand the world so they can navigate it on their own terms." Evelyn's eyes had that determined gleam that meant she'd already made up her mind and was just being polite by pretending to ask permission. "Then we'll build a school," Gideon said. "Spring project, after the thaw." "I'll help," Clara added. "I never got much formal education, but I can read and write well enough, and I can teach practical skills: hunting, tracking, survival. Between the three of us, we'll give them something better than what most towns offer," Evelyn said with satisfaction. "Knowledge without prejudice. Skills without limitation based on gender or background. A real education." They fell silent again, but it was a companionable silence, full of shared understanding and plans for the future. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent, covering the valley in white. Gideon watched it through the window and thought about cycles, about how a year ago snow had brought Clara and Evelyn to his door and changed everything. Now it was just weather, just the natural rhythm of seasons in the high country. The fear and isolation it had once represented had been replaced by the warm knowledge that he wasn't facing it alone. "Thank you," he said quietly, knowing they'd understand what he meant even without elaboration. Clara took one of his hands, Evelyn took the other, and they sat that way as the snow fell and the fire crackled and the world outside grew cold and white. Inside there was warmth and family and the future they'd fought so hard to claim. Winter came hard that year, but they were ready for it. The cabins were tight and well-provisioned. The community worked together, sharing resources and labor, watching out for each other the way families were supposed to. When supplies ran low, they rationed fairly. When illness struck, they nursed each other through it. When the isolation became too much, they gathered for communal meals and music and the simple comfort of not being alone. Spring brought the baby, Thomas and Marie's daughter, born healthy and loud in the smallest cabin with Evelyn acting as midwife. They named her Hope, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was the first child born into their community, the first tangible proof that they were building something sustainable, something that would outlast them. True to Evelyn's prediction, the Johnsons announced they were expecting in June, and surprisingly, so did Clara. She told Gideon one evening in late spring when they were working together to expand the main cabin. She'd been quiet all day, which wasn't like her, and finally she just blurted it out. "I'm pregnant. About 3 months, I think. Maybe 4. Gideon's hand stilled on the timber he'd been shaping. For a long moment he couldn't speak, couldn't think, could only feel the overwhelming rush of emotions, joy and terror and hope and fear all mixed together until he couldn't separate them. "You're sure?" he finally managed. Evelyn confirmed it. "She has experience with these things, remember?" Clara was watching him carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. "I know this isn't planned, isn't something we discussed. And I know you lost a child before, lost Sarah because of childbirth. If you're not ready—" "I'm terrified," Gideon interrupted. "Terrified of losing you the way I lost her. Terrified of failing another child. But Clara—" He set down his tools and took her hands in his. "I'm also happier than I've been in 13 years. You're giving me something I thought I'd lost forever. A chance at being a father. A chance at the family I wanted with Sarah, but never got to have. So yes, I'm terrified. But I'm also grateful beyond words." She kissed him then, fierce and desperate and full of relief. "We're going to be all right," she said against his lips. "All of us. You and me and Evelyn and this baby. We're going to be all right. Promise?" It came out more vulnerable than he'd intended, more like the plea of a frightened man than the statement of someone confident in the future. "I promise," Clara said, and he chose to believe her. The pregnancy progressed through summer and into fall. Evelyn watched Clara like a hawk, monitoring her health with the kind of attention she'd probably given to particularly promising students. The community rallied around them, building a cradle, knitting tiny clothes, offering advice and support, and the 1,000 small kindnesses that turned neighbors into family. Gideon found himself holding his breath for months, waiting for disaster, unable to fully believe that happiness this profound could be allowed to last. Every time Clara seemed tired or complained of pain, his heart would seize with the memory of Sarah's final days. But Evelyn was patient with his fears, explaining what was normal, what to watch for, how to tell the difference between ordinary discomfort and real danger. "She's strong," Evelyn told him one evening when his anxiety was particularly obvious. "Stronger than Sarah was, no offense to her memory. And she's healthy, well-fed, not fighting off fever or disease. The odds are good, Gideon. You need to trust that." "I'm trying," he said, "but trusting doesn't come naturally to me anymore." "Then trust me. I've helped deliver 11 babies over the years, and I've developed a good sense for when things are going wrong. Claire's doing fine. The baby's doing fine. You need to let yourself believe that, or you're going to worry yourself into an early grave." So he tried to focus on the present instead of the fearful future. Tried to enjoy the moments of Clara's hand on her swelling belly, or the way she'd started unconsciously humming lullabies while she worked. Tried to build hope instead of anticipating grief. The baby came in late November during the first major snowstorm of the season. Evelyn had predicted the timing almost perfectly, and when Clara's labor started, she was ready, organized, calm, in a way that helped Gideon hold himself together when every instinct screamed at him to panic. "You're going to wait outside," Evelyn told him firmly. "I don't care how much you protest. Having you here wringing your hands and remembering Sarah isn't going to help Clara, and she needs our focus on her, not on managing your fear." She was right, and Gideon knew it, but being sent away while Clara labored felt like abandonment. He paced outside the cabin for hours, ignoring the snow and cold, listening to the sounds from inside and trying not to imagine the worst. Thomas and Jacob from the neighboring cabin joined him, building a fire and keeping watch in the kind of silent male solidarity that didn't require words. When Gideon's pacing became too agitated, they'd steer him back to the fire. When his silence stretched too long, they'd make quiet comments about nothing in particular just to remind him he wasn't alone. The wait felt eternal. Hours passed with agonizing slowness, marked only by the deepening snow and the occasional sounds from inside the cabin. Clara's voice raised in pain or effort, Evelyn's calm instructions, Marie's softer encouragement as she helped. Then finally, the sound Gideon had been simultaneously longing for and dreading. A baby's cry, thin and outraged, and absolutely, perfectly alive. He was moving before he consciously decided to, through the door and into the cabin where Clara lay exhausted but smiling. A tiny bundled form in her arms. Evelyn looked up with tears on her weathered face. "A daughter," she said simply. "Healthy and whole. Come meet your child, Gideon." He crossed the cabin on legs that felt unsteady, knelt beside the bed where Clara lay, and looked at the tiny red face of his daughter. She was perfect. Impossibly small and fragile, but perfect. Dark hair like Clara's, eyes that would probably be his own gray, tiny fists waving in the air as if already ready to fight the world. "She's beautiful," he managed, his voice breaking on the words. "She's yours," Clara said, her own voice hoarse from hours of labor. "Ours. We did it, Gideon. We made something good and new and completely ours." He leaned down to kiss her forehead, then carefully touched one finger to his daughter's cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin. "What should we name her?" Clara and Evelyn exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them. Then Clara smiled. "I was thinking Sarah, if that's all right with you, to honor what you lost and what we've found." The grief that had lived in Gideon's chest for 13 years finally released its grip, transformed not into forgetting, but into something gentler. His first wife would be remembered not in isolation and sorrow, but in the joy of this new life, this new beginning. "Sarah, he said, testing the name. "Sarah Evelyn Thorne." Using my name as well? Evelyn's voice was thick with emotion. That's not necessary. It absolutely is, Clara interrupted. You're as much this baby's grandmother as if we were blood. You'll be the one teaching her to read, to think, to stand up for herself. Your name belongs here. Evelyn didn't try to hide her tears then, just let them fall as she looked at the tiny girl who'd already become the center of their world. Then I'm honored, deeply honored. The community celebrated the birth with the kind of joy that came from shared investment in each other's happiness. They brought food and gifts, told stories, and offered blessings that had nothing to do with churches or formal religion and everything to do with hope and goodwill. Little Sarah Evelyn Thorne was welcomed into a family that included her parents and grandmother, yes, but also the extended network of outcasts and refugees who'd found their way to this valley and made it home. As winter deepened and the new year turned, Gideon found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. 13 years ago, he'd been a different man, younger, less scarred, with a wife he loved, and dreams of a normal life. That man had died when Sarah and their unborn child died, and what emerged had been a ghost seeking only to survive. But then 2 women had knocked on his door during a blizzard, and everything had changed. They'd cracked open his isolation, reminded him what it meant to care about something beyond mere survival, given him a reason to fight for more than just his own continued existence. Now he had Clara, fierce and brave and more than he deserved. He had Evelyn, wise and strong and the moral center that kept them all grounded. He had baby Sarah, perfect and demanding and full of promise. And he had this community of misfits and outcasts who'd transformed a lonely valley into something that felt like civilization's better qualities without its worst cruelties. You're thinking too much again, Clara said one evening, catching him staring into the fire with that distant look she'd learned to recognize. Baby Sarah was nursing, making small, contented sounds, and Evelyn was reading by lamplight, the picture of domestic peace. Just remembering, Gideon said, remembering what it was like before, and being grateful for what is now. No regrets? Clara asked. 1,000 regrets about the years I wasted, but not a single one about anything that's happened since you knocked on my door. He reached over to run a gentle hand over Sarah's downy hair. This is what I was meant for. Not isolation, not just survival. This, family, community, building something that matters. We built it together, Evelyn said without looking up from her book. All of us. That's what makes it strong. Spring came again, then summer, then autumn. The cycles continued, marked now not by isolation but by growth. The school was built and filled with children learning not just reading and arithmetic, but how to think for themselves, how to question authority, how to build lives of dignity regardless of what society said about them. More people came, drawn by stories of the valley where outcasts could find acceptance. Some stayed, some moved on after resting and resupplying, but all of them left knowing there was a place in the world where they'd been welcomed without judgment. Gideon watched it all with wonder and satisfaction, this accidental community that had grown from 3 desperate survivors into something larger and more meaningful. He'd come to the mountains to disappear, and instead he'd found purpose. He'd sought isolation and found family. He'd expected to end his days alone and unloved, and instead he was surrounded by people who needed him and people he needed in return. On Sarah's first birthday, the entire community gathered for a celebration. There was food and music and laughter, children running wild between the cabins while their parents watched with the kind of relaxed attention that came from knowing everyone here would keep them safe. Baby Sarah, just starting to walk, toddled from person to person collecting affection and attention with the imperious demand of someone who'd been loved from her first breath. As the sun set and the party continued, Gideon found himself standing a little apart, watching the scene with Clara beside him, and Evelyn on his other side. The 3 of them, the foundation on which everything else had been built. You know what I think about sometimes? Clara said quietly, her hand finding his. I think about that night I knocked on your door. How close I came to not climbing high enough, to missing your cabin entirely in the storm. How different everything would be if you'd turned us away. I think about it too, Gideon admitted. Think about how close I came to letting you freeze rather than opening my door, And I wonder what guardian angel or twist of fate or pure dumb luck made me make the choice I did. Not luck, Evelyn said firmly. Choice. You chose kindness over safety, connection over isolation. That's not luck, that's character. And it saved all of us, Clara and me, from death, and you from a life that was no life at all. We saved each other, Clara said. That's what family does. And standing there in the valley he'd never expected to call home, surrounded by the family he'd never expected to have, Gideon Thorne finally understood what he'd been searching for during all those years alone. Not escape from pain, that was impossible. Pain was part of being human, not safety from loss. You couldn't love without risking grief. What he'd been searching for, what he'd finally found, was simple and profound. Belonging. Connection. The knowledge that his life mattered not just to himself, but to others. That he was part of something larger than his own survival, something worth fighting for and building and protecting. The mountain ghost, they'd called him in Sterling Falls and beyond. The hermit of Blackrock. The man who'd disappeared into the wilderness and wanted nothing to do with the world of people. But that ghost was gone now, laid to rest alongside the grief that had created him. In his place stood Gideon Thorne, husband, father, friend, and protector of a community that had become his reason for living. As the stars came out overhead and the celebration continued around them, he pulled Clara close with one arm and rested his other hand on Evelyn's shoulder, and felt more alive than he had in 13 years. The winter that had tried to kill them had instead given birth to spring. The isolation that had seemed like his only option had transformed into connection. The man who'd wanted only to survive had learned, finally, to live. And in a valley hidden high in the Rockies, where outcasts became family and survival became thriving, that was more than enough. It was everything.